From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $99 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. We are working through May 1999 currently. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. May 3, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Death of Rick Rude. WWF Backlash Review, more. By Observer Staff. The death of Rick Rude on April 20th becomes the latest addition to a strange and macabre body count that is very close to becoming synonymous with the pro wrestling industry. Rude passed away that evening of a heart attack after being rushed to the North Fulton Medical Center near his home in Alpharetta, Georgia, an Atlanta suburb, at the age of 40. Rude, who was working with WCW as an announcer for the Backstage Blast pay-per-view airings of Nitro on DirecTV once per month after being removed from his role as childhood friend Curt Hennig's on-camera manager, had been training for an in-ring comeback after his career presumably had ended after suffering a broken back in a May 1, 1994 match against Sting at the Fukuoka Dome. Rude's death becomes the 25th known death of an active young pro wrestling personality over the past 6 years and the 6th death of someone actively participating in the business so far in 1999. Rude, whose legal name was Richard Irwin Rude, had a friendship with Hennig that dated back to childhood. His father Dick and Kurt's father Larry, a famous pro wrestler of a generation ago, are also longtime friends. Rude and Hennig attended Robbinsdale High School near Minneapolis together. That afternoon Rude had taken his 8-year-old son to school, attended a martial arts class and went out to hit some golf balls. About 5 p.m. his wife returned from shopping and found him on the floor barely breathing and with a light pulse. She called 911, and he was revived briefly in the ambulance before going into a coma and suffering cardiac arrest in the hospital. The heart attack is being investigated as a possible drug overdose. There were empty prescription pill bottles found near his bed. The Fulton County Medical Examiner's Office reported on April 22 that the autopsy could not pinpoint a cause of death, and it is officially being labeled as pending upon completion of toxicology tests, which could take several weeks or even months. Nobody seemingly saw this particular incident coming, although incidents like this are no longer unexpected. Due to a wrestling public that has been numbed with the frequency of out-of-the-ring incidents that at one time in this sport and even today in any other sport would have been considered alarming, are now considered regular weekly occurrences. A wrestling star, even one of the biggest names from a past era, dying at a young age is no longer surprising or shocking to the wrestling public at large. The big picture in many cases, the 3 children and a wife left behind, which is another pattern in many of these deaths, will be forgotten as people attempt to circumvent what they fear may be the bigger truth and hide from bad publicity because this may be another case of being too much of a regular pattern. Rude had been attempting to get out of his WCW contract since at least December, presumably to wrestle in the WWF. At one point he threatened Eric Bischoff that he'd just show up in the stands on a WWF television broadcast, not realizing his contract prohibited that and that due to all the legal problems between the two companies the WWF wouldn't have allowed it either without a release from WCW. There had been bad blood over Bischoff signing Rude from WWF for $300,000 per year on a 3-year deal in a notable coup in late 1997, with Rude appearing, sans beard, on Nitro earlier in the evening, with him appearing later that evening with a beard, on a taped Raw 6 days earlier, but, like so many others, never pushing him, although realistically it's hard to fault Bischoff on this score as he did try to groom him for a heel announcer role which turned out not to be his forte. Rude had told friends that he was going to confront Kevin Nash, claiming Nash also promised him a larger announcing role. Before signing with WCW, Rude had been working WWF without a contract and had been negotiating with Bischoff for weeks for the right time to perform the jump. Rude was brought in originally to be a heel NWO television announcer based on his work in ECW. However, once given the shot, it was something he was clearly not cut out for. His ECW work, while initially funny, ran out of steam by the 2nd or 3rd week, and Paul Heyman kept him in the role just long enough to create an angle to turn him heel and get him out. The bad blood was such that at Rude's viewing on April 23, Rude's mother asked Bischoff, who came with his wife, when he showed up, to leave, which Bischoff quietly did. There has been acknowledgement from friends of Rude and others that at about the time he started trying to get out of his WCW deal, that he made contact with the WWF and tried to set up a comeback, pitching them on the idea of a run against Steve Austin. The two were friends and sometimes tag team partners in the early 90s when they were in WCW together as members of the Dangerous Alliance. The holdup, besides being under contract to WCW, was that he had received a 7-figure settlement from Lloyd's of London claiming his 1994 broken back had ended his career as an active wrestler. The settlement, combined with a lawsuit against WCW for what he claimed was his career-ending injury, that wasn't settled until the new deal was made, was the reason that when Rude had worked as a manager/bodyguard/insurance policy role in ECW, WCW and the WWF over the past 2 years, that whenever he was involved in anything physical, it was very limited. He could be on a fence, but because of his agreements, was not allowed to be put in a position where he would have to take a bump, since he claimed the back injury prevented him from doing that part of the pro wrestling job description. Rude had attempted to get WCW and had talked with WWF, although the talking never got past the preliminary stages of paying off Lloyd's of London on his permanent disability claim, which would allow him to return as an active wrestler. Lloyd's of London, which no longer will insure pro wrestlers, paid off similar claims to Hennig and Joe Laurinaitis, Road Warrior Animal, who both, after taking several years off and collecting on a large disability payment, ended up returning to the ring. Laurinaitis' deal ended up where he claimed he would be able to function as a tag team wrestler, but not as a singles wrestler, which is why he hasn't been booked in any singles matches in the WWF, and the WWF has never been able to go anywhere with a Hawk vs. Animal feud, which would seem to have been about the only thing left for the team at one point. Probably now it's too late for people to even care about that. According to friends, Rude had been training intensely for a comeback, even though no such deal was specifically on the table. He was in the process of building a new home on 20 acres in Rome, Georgia, and talked of opening a pro wrestling camp on the property. He had just purchased a new truck. He was about 255 pounds and looking almost as muscular as ever, at a considerably higher body weight than during most of his career up until a recent bout with pneumonia caused him to drop nearly 40 pounds. At the time of his death, he had gained some of the weight back and was in excess of 235 pounds. During his career, his weight generally varied from as low as 205 off steroids to about 235. He was a great entertainer, said his wife Michelle, 33. He was nothing like the person in the ring. He was a great family man. He lived for his kids, and he ate and slept wrestling. With no cause of death, the speculation has run rampant. There had been a series of incidents going back 2 months. On March 1st, when Rude was brought to Chapel Hill, North Carolina to do the backstage blast, he literally passed out on the set in between on-air segments, and his performance was said to have been embarrassing to the point it was debated between segments about even allowing him to continue on camera. His next assignment, the April 5th backstage blast in Las Vegas, he missed due to the pneumonia. 4 days later, near his home, he was arrested on a DUI. Within wrestling, much of the talk links it to gamma-hydroxybutyrate, commonly known as GHB, a drug also known as ecstasy, which from several sources is considered epidemic within the company, and many claim throughout pro wrestling. There have been many behind-the-scenes incidents involving pro wrestling personalities over the past 2 months that are commonly traced to abuse of GHB, including one near-death experience in a dressing room, and an incident that is believed traced to the drug that cost a former WWF performer his job. The drug was very popular in pro wrestling and nightclubs in the early 90s before it was taken off the market due to the incidences of problems. A new form is more readily available, and is popular among bodybuilders and strippers because it induces quick and deep sleep, and allegedly increases the secretion of growth hormone while sleeping, and thus leads to burning more calories while sleeping and thus cutting body fat, considered particularly beneficial to women who have a hard time fighting nature when it comes to maintaining youthful legs. Because of how GHB breaks down in the body, if this was the case, it probably will never show up in a coroner's report. Nor, as noted in the ESPN Outside the Lines segment, would human growth hormone. The natural speculation, given his physique, would also gravitate towards speculation about steroids, which frequently elevate blood pressure and in extreme cases can lead to heart attacks. There is no indication Rude ever used HGH. Rude's steroid use was well documented. Richard Rude was born December 7, 1958 and grew up in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. After high school, he was working as a bouncer at Grandma B's, considered the toughest bar in the northeastern section of Minneapolis, along with Laurinaitis, Michael Hegstrand, Road Warrior Hawk, and Barry Darsow. He was considered to be the toughest of the four, even though he was the lightest, and was noted for being so powerful he often was able to knock people out with an open-handed slap. Years later, while in pro wrestling, he knocked out 400-pound Samoan Paul Noy, who wrestled as PN News, and who currently works in Austria as Cannonball Grizzly, while the two had a problem with one open-handed slap. Although very muscular and known in particular for having perhaps the best abs of any wrestler in modern wrestling, which he credited to having great genetics, and deceptively tall at 6'4", because of his relatively thin legs and long thin torso, he had the look of being in great condition, but not necessarily of great power. But obviously those looks were deceiving, as he had incredible grip strength, said to be similar to Danny Hodge, and was well known as a tough street fighter. He was a noted arm wrestler, finishing 6th in the World Championships held in Las Vegas in the light heavyweight division in 1983 after placing 2nd in the U.S. Nationals in 1980. You can talk about this and that guy being a great shooter, noted Eddie Sharkey, who trained Rude, Darsow, the Road Warriors, Nikita Koloff and numerous others for pro wrestling. But this guy kicked more ass than any of them. People didn't realize how tough this guy was. Nobody could come close to him. He'd slap guys with an open hand and it looked like their head exploded. Sharkey also noted that Rude was so strong at arm wrestling that he was able to put down Hawk, who was a much larger man at the time, even allowing Hawk to use both his arms against one of his. Growing up in Minneapolis in the early 80s, where wrestling was part of the local culture with the likes of the Crusher, Vern Gagne, Baron von Raschke, Bobby Heenan, Mad Dog Vachon, Nick Bockwinkel, Jesse Ventura and later peaking with Hulk Hogan, it was more natural for young tough gym rats and bouncers to think about pro wrestling more than other parts of the country. In 1981, Rude was training for a Tough Man contest under Ray Webb Jr., a local figure and promoter who had ties to both the city's boxing and pro wrestling community. He had a 2-0 record as an amateur boxer training under Papa Joe Dastewicz, a noted local boxing figure. Some say he could have made a lot of money as a boxer. But he and the others all gravitated toward pro wrestling and made a lot more. He had no money at the time, so he got friends to loan him the money to pay for his training under Sharkey. He broke into wrestling and often barely had enough money for gas to get to his matches and would sleep in his car. When he became a money player in pro wrestling, he paid everyone back. Years later, when Sharkey was down on his luck after serving a term in prison and was working as a referee for the WWF, and Ravishing Rick Rude was by then a headliner, he showed up at a card in Minneapolis and gave Sharkey a bag filled with $3,000 in cash. Rude and Hegstrand were being trained by Sharkey to be a tag team when Sharkey invited Ole Anderson, who was running Georgia Championship Wrestling Incorporated, which had the best national television exposure in the country on WTBS about a year before Vince McMahon took the WWF National, up to his camp to look at his huge, by the standards of the time, students. Anderson had just seen the movie Road Warrior a week or two earlier and wanted a huge bodybuilder to play the role in late 1982, and picked Laurinaitis for the role. Rude, Hegstrand and Laurinaitis all started wrestling at that time, and all paying their dues, getting no push and making no money in different parts of the country, quit almost immediately. Sharkey urged them to stick it out. A few months later, Anderson, who was grooming a young tag team of Arn Anderson and Matt Bourne to be his top heel combination, saw Bourne get arrested on a sexual assault charge and have to leave the territory. Ole needed a team in a hurry and Sharkey recommended Rude and Hegstrand. He flew back to Minneapolis, picked Hegstrand and Laurinaitis, using the Road Warriors gimmick, and Bill Watts later came up with the idea for the face paint, and the two were immediate sensations. A few weeks later, Anderson, starving for new talent as business was in a weak period due to the promotion being screwed up, a disease that would plague Atlanta-based wrestling offices more often than not over the next 16 years, brought Rude and Darsow in. Rude was given a minor push at the beginning, miscast because of his looks, not recognizing he had a certain attitude that made him a natural heel, as a babyface with a gimmick, creatively enough, as the toughest bouncer in Minneapolis, who was a former arm wrestling champion, to feud with then national heavyweight champion Larry Zbyszko. He didn't last long in Georgia and was sent to work briefly for Jim Crockett in the Carolinas as jobber Ricky Rude, sounding more like a race car driver, and later Watts in the Mid-South Territory as a good-looking undercard babyface. Watts had nothing for him either, but it was Jerry Jarrett who made him a star. In early 1984, Watts was bringing Bill Dundee in as booker and he brought in the likes of the Rock and Roll Express, Bobby Eaton and Dennis Condrey who formed a tag team called the Midnight Express, taken from an Alabama tag team trio of Condrey and Norvell Austin and Randy Rose who had first used the Midnight Express name a few years earlier. Terry Taylor and Jim Cornette among others from Memphis that were basically second-teamers in Memphis that Dundee and Watts saw a lot of potential in, although they succeeded probably beyond either's expectations as it led to the hottest run that Territory would ever have. Watts sent Jarrett a few wrestlers that he had no more use for in exchange since he was adding so much new talent, Rude, King Kong Bundy and Jim Neidhart being the most notable. With only about 1 year full-time in the business and never having been given a serious push, Jarrett changed his name to Ravishing Rick Rude, gave him the popular song Smooth Operator as his ring music, which followed him around until his WWF days, and he was given a monstrous heel push with Valet Angel, playing the role he'd continued to play throughout his active career. At the time Rude wasn't particularly good in the ring, Although since most of his main events were against Lawler, who at the time was one of the experts in the business at carrying guys, there was no problem in him headlining, although against the less talented Austin Idol, his weaknesses were somewhat apparent. His interviews weren't polished either, although the potential was there in that he had a great delivery, almost the caliber of Jesse Ventura, although he didn't have Ventura's gift of coming up with creative interviews. His strong delivery and arrogant personality made people believe he truly hated opponents like Jerry Lawler, Austin Idol, Randy Savage and the Fabulous Ones, and hate him for it. He even in his first territory as a headliner generated unusually great heat. He had a few traits that couldn't be taught that made him one of the great heels of his time that were evident almost from the start in Memphis, and really looking back to his start in Atlanta, although Jarrett was the first to pick up on them. He had movie star looks. He had a unique chiseled physique. He was a tall, very tough man, and he knew it. He had the confidence and the arrogance to go along with it, and he became a natural in displaying those qualities in front of the camera. Rude had memorable programs during a period when Jarrett's business was extremely strong, working as the main heel in the company for several months, managed by Jimmy Hart and frequently teaming with Bundy. Somewhere along the way, Angel disappeared, never to be seen again. But Rude was made as a star. He went next to Florida, under Dory Funk as booker. Rude had a good look, but in a territory based more on in-ring performance, he was usually paired as a tag team with Jesse Barr, the worker Funk really liked and thought was going to be a future superstar, as almost a Florida version of Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis, pairing the colorful guy with a great physique with a more ordinary-looking guy who was a great worker to handle the bulk of the in-ring work. Still, Rude was put on top as Southern Heavyweight Champion, with his most notable feud being with Wahoo McDaniel. Apparently at some point during that run, there was a dispute between the two of them. McDaniel, while past 45 at the time, was a legendary tough guy in both football a decade earlier and since then in wrestling. Apparently knowing Rude's reputation, apparently backed down in the confrontation, something he wasn't prone to do. Inside of wrestling, as the word spread, people who didn't know of Rude anything more than one of a million guys who worked on top in Memphis against Lawler, recognized he must be one dangerous man. He met his future wife, who he married 3 years later, while working out of Tampa. His next stop was Texas starting in late 1985, for World Class Championship Wrestling, where, as a trivia note, he became the first ever WCWA World Heavyweight Champion. He was American Heavyweight Champion at the time. Jim Crockett made it very difficult for other promotions to book Ric Flair, at the time the NWA Champion, because he was planning on touring nationally using Flair as his top star and needed him for new markets. In response, Fritz von Erich, who headed the Dallas office, decided to withdraw from the NWA and doing so, elevated the American title, which Rude held, to a world title. Rude headlined against all the Von Erichs along with the likes of Bruiser Brody and Chris Adams during his run in that area, which lasted until late 1986. On the biggest show to that point in his career, he worked the semi-main event on the May 4, 1986 show in Texas Stadium that drew 24,121 fans, paying $193,108 in defending the WCWA title, winning via DQ against Brody, which was the last true big money show in the history of that territory. During that year, he was managed by not only a much slimmer Percy Pringle, Paul Bearer, but also had a red-haired female valet named Raven with a bodybuilder look, which it was never acknowledged at the time was actually his sister. Next stop was Crockett's office, which at this point had gotten the TBS contract and thus was Vince McMahon's only real national competitor during the late 80s. Rude arrived in late 1986 and immediately was programmed as a mid-card heel feuding with old rival McDaniel. Eventually he was put together as a heel tag team with Manny Fernandez, who had just turned on Dusty Rhodes, and both were managed by Paul Jones. The two spent several months feuding with the Rock and Roll Express over the NWA World Tag Team titles, which Rude and Fernandez quickly won since the Express was better in the role of chasing the belts than holding them against a heel team that needed to make a reputation. In May of 1987, Rude, without giving notice or dropping the belts, which wasn't that unusual in days where wrestling contracts consisted of a handshake and the wrestling war was brutal, left JCP while holding one half of the tag team titles. Clumsily, they announced on TBS that Rude had been injured and that Ivan Koloff was replacing him on the championship team. It got even weirder, because about a week later, Fernandez walked out on the promotion as well. Eventually this was settled by JCP airing a tape of a match taped months earlier in Columbia, South Carolina, but announced on television that had taken place on May 26, 1987 in Spokane, Washington, a city JCP wasn't even running, where Rock and Roll Express had won what was at the time a non-title match taped for a Japanese World Pro Wrestling television show, and was labeled as the title change, A clumsy scenario since they aired Rude after just announcing he was badly injured and wouldn't be back. WWF was the land of the giants. Rude had a great physique. Most notable was his long torso, and with the body fat kept down, led his impressive abs, which Rude's pre-match dance highlighted. There was a knock on Rude at that time that his physique, because it wasn't thick bulky enough and because his in-ring talents weren't particularly great at the time, that he'd have a tough time getting past a certain level on a national promotion even though he made a very good regional top heel. A few things happened to change that. First, he got even more heavily into the steroids so size-wise he could match up to most of the main events. Still, because of his natural thin frame, even bulked up, he was never considered to have enough weight for a program with main man Hulk Hogan even though he was a stronger heel than the majority of the men Hogan was programmed with. He was packaged more as a stripper type, as the current character of Val Venis was based on being a modernized version of Rude. With the swivel hips and the pelvic thrust, he became a human catchphrase a decade before the business revolved around them. What I'd like to have right now, if for all you fat, out of shape, insert city sweathogs to take a lot at what a real man is supposed to look like, as he'd open his rope heavily flexing his arms and abs, generally to thunderous boos. Although time has erased this from history, Rude was not an instant success in the WWF. He languished in undercards for several months until coming up with the catchphrase entrance and hitting it big with his first program, and perhaps his most memorable of all, with Jake Roberts, which started when he tried to hit on Roberts' wife Cheryl in an angle that was apparently years ahead of its time. Even though Roberts pinned Rude every night everywhere, Rude's arrogance was such that he continued to get great heat everywhere he went and got over stronger. The feud continued for most of 1988, eventually with Rude being managed by Bobby Heenan. Rude's arrogance in the ring was such that as great a heel as he was in territories, every attempt to turn him face fizzled. The irony is that during his active career, Rude was never a success anywhere as a face, although he was very successful just about everywhere as a heel. But if that same character would come along now, he'd be a huge face. Along with Roberts, his other big program of his WWF era was with the Ultimate Warrior. Rude scored one of the first and one of the exceedingly few pinfalls on Warrior in his WWF tenure when he won the Intercontinental title on April 2, 1989 at WrestleMania V in Atlantic City, leading to Warrior regaining the belt at the second annual SummerSlam on August 28, 1989 at the Meadowlands Arena as the second match from the top beneath Hogan. By this point, Rude had upped his work rate to where he became almost a bumping machine, which led to him being able to be one of the few who could get a good match out of Warrior. About the only others were Savage and Ted DiBiase, two of the best workers of the era. Of course, this also led to numerous injuries and ultimately, early retirement. After Warrior had captured the WWF title at WrestleMania 6 from Hulk Hogan at Toronto Skydome, Rude, who had largely feuded with Dusty Rhodes, was elevated to the top of the cards with the storyline being that he was the one who had beaten Warrior for the IC title, climaxing with Warrior winning a cage match in the main event at SummerSlam on August 27, 1990 in Philadelphia before a sellout 19,304 fans and drawing a 3.8 buy rate. As it turned out, this was the only pay-per-view show that he headlined as a single. He headlined only one other pay-per-view show, the May 17, 1992 WCW Wrestle War from Jacksonville, Florida in a War Games match as the Dangerous Alliance of himself, Arn Anderson, Bobby Eaton, Austin and Zbyszko lost to Sting and Nikita Koloff and Dustin Rhodes and Ricky Steamboat and Barry Windham before 6,000 fans and drawing in 0.6 buy rate. His WWF career ended shortly after his SummerSlam main event after a dispute with McMahon. While out of action with a torn tricep, the WWF continued to advertise him for a house show run against Warrior in the main events. While business was disappointing during this period as Warrior was a weaker than expected draw as champion after Hogan, Rude was still the heel challenging for the title in all the advertising in the top arenas. Rude felt that his name was being used to draw the houses, however McMahon was paying him very little based on the fact he wasn't wrestling on those shows, and in those days before significant guaranteed money contracts, injured wrestlers were not well paid until they got back into action. He eventually quit the company over that dispute over not getting paid main event money on those shows. As was the case at that time, even after quitting, the WWF continued to advertise him as appearing on shows as a headliner for more than another month, including in some markets billing him as appearing on shows where the advertising had not even gone out until after he had quit. I can recall speaking with J.J. Dillon at this time about this problem, and his response was that the WWF felt that since Rude's contract hadn't expired and since the official release wasn't signed, that they had the right to advertise him to appear, even knowing full well that he had quit on the guise that, who knows, he may decide to come back and at that point it wouldn't be false advertising. Vince always treated my husband very well, said Michelle Rude. He goes by talent. Some other promoters didn't go by talent. Rick spoke what he felt. A lot of promoters didn't like that. Vince respected that and understood that. Others didn't and held it against him. Rude worked independence and All Japan, where Giant Baba wouldn't allow him to do his pre-match mic work or his stripper dance, and where his punch/kick offense and thin build didn't get him over past a mid-level foreigner, but fans did get into the personality he was allowed to show as an acceptable mid-carder, until his WWF contract expired. His style wasn't considered Japan-friendly, although he proved it wrong, as he did very well with New Japan on big shows over the next 2 years after he signed with WCW. After his WWF deal expired, on October 27, 1991, he debuted with WCW under a mask as the Halloween Phantom, using the Rude Awakening on Tom Zenk in 127 and got the mega push. 3 weeks later, on a televised Clash of the Champion, he captured the U.S. title from Sting due to outside interference from Lex Luger, beginning the last memorable feud of his active career, and one which left very bitter feelings since Rude blamed Sting for his career-ending injury nearly 3 years later. Without question, his career peaked in 1992, when he was the best heel in the entire business and one of its top workers and headlined numerous house shows against Sting. But just as he really hit his stride as an all-around performer, injuries began breaking him down. Rude mainly feuded with Steamboat over the U.S. title in early 1992 in matches that were generally considered good but not great. What may have been the best match of his career was on August 12, 1992, at the finals of both the G1 and NWA World Heavyweight Title Tournament, losing to Masahiro Chono in 29:44 before a sellout 11,500 fans at Tokyo Sumo Hall. He is the only foreigner ever to go to the finals of a G1 tournament. Rude went through Super Strong Machine, Junji Hirata, Shinya Hashimoto and Kensuke Sasaki to reach the finals. As an aside, before his Sumo Hall match with Hashimoto, when he delivered his "Well, I'd like to have right now" speech with Medusa, who had made a name herself in Japan as a pro wrestler, as his valet, the crowd cheered wildly, knowing it was Rude's pre-match mic performance, but not knowing what he was actually saying, which was peppered with some racial slurs. By the time the finals came around 2 nights later, the word had gotten around as to what he was actually saying, and the crowd response had changed completely, to where he got every bit the heat the routine would get in the United States. Rude and Chono ironically followed that Match of the Year caliber performance at Sumo Hall into a Worst Match of the Year winner at Halloween Havoc just 10 weeks later on October 25, 1992, where Chono lost via DQ to retain the title at Philadelphia Civic Center. In between, Chono had been dropped on his head with a too-low version of a tombstone piledriver by Austin in a match in Yokohama, with the result being eerily similar to Austin later having the same thing happen to him from Owen Hart 5 years later. Chono was really never the same after that point, but wasn't close to being ready for the Philadelphia match. Rude and Sting were tearing houses down with classic U.S. title matches, with Rude being his bumping machine until being sidelined with 2 bulging discs, one of which pressed on a nerve, and Watts, in charge of WCW at the time, decided Rude had to vacate the title because he was going to be out of action for several weeks. Rude was somewhat upset at that, but more upset when Watts, with his old school values, cut Rude's pay since he wasn't going on the road and wrestling, which left Rude furious once again since he was injured in the ring. Rude eventually returned, but in the ring was never the same. By this point his reputation in wrestling was strong enough that it didn't really matter. He was scheduled to win the NWA World Heavyweight title finally from Ric Flair on September 19, 1993 in Houston, Texas, at the Fall Brawl pay-per-view show. Interviews were taped, at the time when WCW would tape worldwide and do angles for months in advance, in Orlando that summer, with Rude holding the belt and talking about upcoming defenses, long before the Flair match was actually announced. The NWA Board of Governors, such as they were upset at WCW for making the title change without consulting with them first and voted to refuse to allow the change. This led to the final WCW-NWA split. On television, after Rude beat Flair for the same physical belt that had been the NWA World title belt dating back to the mid-80s, it was announced as quickly and quietly as possible while still fulfilling the directive of court rulings, that Rude was not the NWA champion. It was stated that WCW International, an organization separate from WCW, had created a world title, so this was referred to as the WCW International World title in the United States, and simply the WCW International Heavyweight title in Japan. When Rude lost and regained the title in 2 matches with Hiroshi Hashi before losing it to Sting on April 17, 1994 at the Spring Stampede pay-per-view show in Chicago at the Rosemont Horizon. The final match of Rude's career as an active pro wrestler took place 2 weeks later. With his wife expecting the couple's second child, Marissa, who celebrated her 5th birthday 1 week after her father's death. They induced labor so he could be there for the birth. She was born the morning of April 27, 1994. He had to leave the country later that day for Japan, where he was scheduled to win back a world title. While wrestling Sting at the Fukuoka Dome before 53,500 fans on a show headlined by Antonio Inoki vs. Great Muta, Sting did a running over-the-top rope dive. Rude caught Sting, but the way the ringside area was structured had a board elevated maybe a foot or so above the ground, surrounding the ringside area. In going down catching Sting, Rude's back landed half on the board, breaking when the top half had nowhere to evenly break the fall, blowing out the C4 and C5 vertebrae. Rude blamed Sting for being careless in where he dove, and there was tremendous heat between the two, which some feared could turn into a problem when Rude returned in late 1997. That had intensified due to things said during depositions in Rude's later lawsuit against WCW over the incident. Rude got up and won the title with a pile driver and a knee drop off the top rope after distraction from valet Lady Love, who worked his corner in those days only on Japan tours. Rude never wrestled again, and it was a few weeks after the fact announced later the title change was rescinded and given back to Sting due to the controversy surrounding the finish. Rude, injured, was, in very bitter fashion, gone from WCW. He was 35 years old and in the second year of the biggest contract he ever signed, his wife said. And then it basically ended. That just killed him. He was a great entertainer, and it really hurt him that he couldn't perform. Even at the risk of injuring himself seriously, he'd have tried it again. Aside from testifying in the McMahon trial, Rude was out of wrestling for the next 3 years and living in Tampa. There were constant rumors he would return, most of the time to the WWF, but he had made out huge on a settlement from Lloyd's and had a lawsuit ongoing against WCW due to the career-ending injury, and returning to the ring would kill both. Eventually he returned to ECW in 1997 in the role of a television announcer who was there to screw with Shane Douglas, until turning on Tommy Dreamer. At about the same time, WWF hired him to work television tapings as an insurance policy with Shawn Michaels and Hunter Hearst Helmsley in the original incarnation of DX, before he stunned both groups that he was working for simultaneously without a contract, by signing with WCW, since both groups thought that wasn't even an option because of his hatred for the company and the lawsuit. As part of his deal, he dropped his lawsuit. And the WWF did attempt to bury him on the way out, having Downtown Bruno dress up in a suit like Rude to give the impression that literally anyone could have filled his position. Rude's rough exterior camouflaged the person who talked at length to other wrestlers about his 3 children, Little Rick, 8, Marissa, and Colton, who is 21 months old. He loved to hunt and fish, particularly with Hennig and Rick Steiner. Friends like Sharky or Bret Hart noted in his passing that he's one person you'd want to have most as backup in a tough situation because you wouldn't have to worry if he'd be there for you. When an athlete, particularly one well known for being heavily into steroids, passes away, particularly from heart complications, the discussion of steroids always comes into place. In Rude's case, the fact he was 210 pounds off steroids, and while cut, was very thin by the standards of wrestling at that weight, and was quite a bit larger during most of his career, particularly his WWF days having to work next to Warrior, and his WCW heyday in 1993 when he appeared to feel he needed a bigger physique to compensate for not being able to work at his previous level. This led to, among other things, what later became a relatively famous conversation with Vince McMahon during one of his programs with Warrior when he wasn't using steroids, that led to Rude being a reluctant witness against McMahon in his 1994 steroid trial. The problem with this subject is that virtually every wrestler from that era used steroids. Most used many other drugs, quite possibly some a lot more dangerous. The deaths are from heart attacks of young athletic men, whether it be Louis Spicolli, Brian Pillman, Larry Cameron, Art Barr, Eddie Gilbert, or whomever else we're talking about. All of the above used steroids, but that doesn't necessarily make them a factor or the major factor if they are a small factor in their deaths. It would be safe to say that just about every wrestler from this era that dies young will have used them. Are steroids the culprit? Probably not in all cases, and probably in some. Steroids rarely lead to an odd type of death, although if someone is on a heavy cycle, his blood pressure would be raised and it would make someone far more susceptible while on a cycle to have a heart problem. So would many other drugs. Friends said Rude had been heavily into parabolan and primobolan. At one time last year it was widely rumored he had testicular cancer, which wasn't the case, but he did have a recurring medical problem due to complications in that area from a steroid shot taken in the early 90s while on a WCW tour of England, and had also suffered from phlebitis. In early 1992, When Kip Frey was running WCW, he made tackling the problem of steroid abuse in his company as one of his top priorities, although before he could get a program seriously off the ground, he was replaced at the company's helm by Bill Watts, who took the approach of not caring. Frey brought doctors in to speak to the wrestlers, and it is remembered how Rude, who had a reputation among the wrestlers as a stand-up guy, and the doctor argued vehemently enough to have caused a major scene at one of the meetings when the doctor was trying to persuade wrestlers to stop using steroids because of their dangers. In the 1994 trial of Vince McMahon and Titan Sports on charges related to steroid distribution, which ended up with McMahon acquitted on charges of conspiring to distribute steroids to his wrestlers, Rude was brought in as a very reluctant government witness. Rude testified that he had used steroids before working for the WWF, while working for the WWF, and after leaving the WWF. When asked how prevalent steroid use was in the WWF, he said he imagined that a lot of people were on them. He said he never got steroids from Dr. George Zahorian, the doctor noted as the leading WWF steroid connection in the 80s. He said that on September 22, 1988 that he and his wife wanted to start a family. He said steroids cut down his testosterone levels so he got off steroids. He said he had a conversation with McMahon who said he felt he didn't look so good. He claimed McMahon told him he was happy with his wrestling and his interviews but disappointed in the way he looked. Rude said he told McMahon he hadn't been partying, but that the schedule was demanding. He said he and his wife wanted to have kids so he wasn't on anything. When prosecuting attorney Sean O'Shea asked him if McMahon told him to get on steroids, Rude said not in those words. When O'Shea asked what he did say, Rude said McMahon told him that when you're down and sore is when you need to push yourself. Rude testified that McMahon may have suggested getting on steroids and may have used the words gas or juice. On cross-examination from McMahon's attorney, Jerry McDevitt, Rude said McMahon never used the word steroids in the conversation. Rude indicated he believed McMahon meant steroids, but when questioned by McDevitt if he was sure that is what McMahon meant, Rude said he wasn't sure. Upon cross-examination from McMahon's other attorney, Laura Bravetti, it was established that Rude continued to use steroids, and not for medical purposes, that he was prescribed by a doctor in England, since by this time steroids were illegal to be prescribed in the United States for anything other than the treatment of a disease, and brought them to the United States. There were probably some people who believed that the death of Pillman some 18 months back would force changes in the profession. Maybe one or two people even felt that after Spicoli died, as his sister noted on television, she wished it would at least save one life, so at least she could feel he didn't die in vain. Seriously, I think people who were hoping that perhaps some good at least for the profession, because the families of these individuals have been given a lifetime sentence that is irrevocable, could possibly be learned. But few have the belief after this that anything will change except the number of the body count. The assembly line will churn out new talent. The promoters will try and make their PR statements about not being policemen and the public not caring. The public won't care. 10 bell salutes at house shows and graphics at the beginning of television shows are on the verge of becoming like the national anthem at the baseball games, a routine occurrence signaling the beginning of the show, a meaning and sadness of which has long been forgotten, and maybe at times, done more for political purposes as a way to avoid actually addressing the issues on television but claiming to not ignore the subject publicly, than anything else. I guess the only thing that many performers within the profession have come to grips with is that this is in many cases a drug sport. Maybe, for a number of reasons, at this point in time, it has to be. Even if it doesn't have to be, there is a reality as to what it is. Certainly it will remain that without huge and widespread changes, and unlike amateur wrestling when it had its problems last year, there is no indication changes will happen or are even seriously being thought about. The pressure of drawing ratings every week occupies so much time that little time is left over for studying what can be done to stop a troubling epidemic, and thus, nothing is done. Men, women, are basically forced to look a certain way, or the public generally won't accept them as great stars unless they are born with freakish size or have an incredible amount of talent and luck to overcome looking natural. Ways that nobody, including people born with exceptional genetics like Richard Rude, can look while living that lifestyle and that schedule without help. They are asked to do things in the ring that a human body simply is not designed to do, at least not for a lengthy period of time, and keep going and not stop. It's a profession where, except in the most extreme of cases, you can't survive at the top unless you learn how to, or get outside help, in ignoring pain. The rewards, both financial and otherwise, are great for making it to the top, greater than at any other time in history. Not all wrestlers that use pain-killing drugs have a serious drug problem. Use is not the problem. It's when the use crosses over to abuse when the problems begin. But even those who make it to the brass ring are often trapped on a career-long treadmill, knowing that the minute they cease to be abnormal, they'll get thrown off. Few can voluntarily walk away. In real life, for better or worse, you'll find very few people who can willingly walk away from fame. It's a more powerful drug than the cocaine or the steroids. So they ride it until they get thrown, and the luckiest ones are the ones who can live out their lives without too much pain and with a healthy bank account. The unlucky ones are doomed to a second lifetime of pain in a profession where most but the most loyal fans forget you 2 weeks after you're off the treadmill. But the most unlucky of all are the families of those who don't get that second lifetime. Whether this business can change may be a question that is immaterial. It won't change until it's forced to change. At least not change based on all the warning signals. The measures it will take by promoters to clean it up aren't going to be done with any quick fix. It'll require a ton of examination of the problem. And none of that is going to be done. Drug testing has been gone through and debated a million times. The tests aren't that hard to beat, and even when athletes do fail, you'd have to rely on the honesty of those who get the results to administer the consequences. If you pay attention, you know athletes are smart enough to talk their way out of positive results many times anyway. So the system doesn't really work that well in the sports that it is done in. I seriously doubt results of tests are reported honestly without compromises and cover-ups in major college and pro sports, and pro wrestling is on the lowest end of the ethics food chain to begin with. But even so, as is seemingly written in these pages now on almost a weekly basis, there is a major difference. People just simply don't die in those sports, or entertainment forms at anywhere close to the rate they do in this one. They don't even die at this rate in boxing. Whatever fingers can be pointed at the NFL or college football for having painkiller and steroid problems, we aren't seeing 15 to 17 guys drop dead every year in the pros and more than 100 in the college game, which would be the statistical equivalence of what is going on in wrestling. Until those within wrestling acknowledge that reality rather than run from it and proclaim it as unfair when these numbers are brought out, nothing is going to change. You can talk about making the schedule easier, and that sounds good on the surface and maybe it would help, but the fact is the schedule for Major League wrestlers today is probably the easiest it has been in the last 15 or 20 years, and the problems still exist, probably on a greater basis than ever. You can't say Rude's work schedule was that difficult at the time of his death. Or Spicoli's. Certainly not by the standards of this business during a time period when people didn't die with nearly this frequency. Rude's death was covered as a major story every half hour on rotation on the ESPN News Channel, along with regularly repeating the segment on deaths of wrestlers concentrating on Brian Pillman, with an eerie scene of Rude at the 10-bell salute on Raw for Pillman, from the Outside the Line show, as well as the same segment airing all day as the cover story on SportsCenter. CNN and Headline News also covered it. It garnered a lot of media play in the Atlanta market, and the newspapers in the Twin Cities also ran stories on his death, but there was little other national coverage. Both Tokyo Sports and Nikkei Sports in Japan ran stories on the death, with steroids speculated as a possible cause. The latter piece also tied in recent health problems of wrestlers like Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith, who were huge stars in Japan. Aside from obits in the Atlanta and Minneapolis media, it didn't receive much other national coverage. Rick Rude. Career Title History. Source: Wrestling Title Histories 3rd edition. World Championship Wrestling International World Heavyweight. Defeated Ric Flair September 19, 1993 Houston. Lost to Hiroshi Hashi March 16, 1994 Tokyo. Defeated Hiroshi Hashi March 24, 1994 Kyoto. Lost to Sting April 17, 1994 Chicago. Defeated Sting May 1, 1994 Fukuoka. Rude quit promotion and vacated title due to suffering a broken back in Fukuoka Dome match, so title change was reversed. World Wrestling Federation Intercontinental Heavyweight. Defeated Ultimate Warrior April 2, 1989 Atlantic City, New Jersey. Lost to Ultimate Warrior August 28, 1989 East Rutherford, New Jersey. National Wrestling Alliance World Tag Team. With Manny Fernandez defeated Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson December 6, 1986 Atlanta. Title vacated when Rude jumped to World Wrestling Federation May 1987. World Championship Wrestling United States Heavyweight. Defeated Sting November 19, 1991 Savannah, Georgia. Vacated title December 1992 due to suffering neck injury. World Class Wrestling Association World Heavyweight. Named first champion February 1986 when American Heavyweight title became World Heavyweight title when World Class promotion left the NWA. Lost to Chris Adams July 4, 1986 Dallas. World Class American Heavyweight. Defeated King Parsons November 4, 1985 Fort Worth. Title was renamed WCWA World Heavyweight title February 1986. World-class television title. Defeated Lance Von Erich May 5, 1986 Fort Worth, lost to Bruiser Brody May 17, 1986 Fort Worth. NWA Southern Heavyweight Florida version. Defeated Pez Whatley January 16, 1985 Tampa. Lost to Brian Blair April 10, 1985 Tampa. Defeated Mike Graham in tournament final to win vacant title July 21, 1985 Orlando. Lost to Wahoo McDaniel October 2, 1985 Tampa. NWA United States Tag Team Florida version. With Jesse Barr defeated Mark and Jay Youngblood April 16, 1985 Tampa. Lost to Wahoo McDaniel and Billy Jack Haynes July 9, 1985 Tampa. Southern Heavyweight Tennessee version. Defeated Jerry Lawler June 11, 1984 Memphis. Lost to Tommy Rich July 22, 1984 Memphis. Southern Tag Team. With King Kong Bundy defeated Stan Lane and Steve Kieran in tournament final October 8, 1984 Memphis to win vacant title. Lost to Stan Lane and Steve Kieran October 22, 1984 Memphis. Wrestling Observer Awards. 1992 Best Heel. 1992 Worst Match of the Year vs. Masahiro Chono October 25 Philadelphia. Steve Austin and Rock bettered their WrestleMania performance in having the best WWF match on pay-per-view thus far in 1999 in the main event of the April 25 Backlash pay-per-view from the Providence Civic Center before a sellout 10,939 paying $293,873 and another $83,283 in merchandise. The show got a mixed response but more on the positive side. It appeared to be a step above the WWF pay-per-view shows thus far this year. The storylines were kept simple with most of the focus being on the antics of Vince and Shane McMahon and The Undertaker as the lead characters in the soap opera, with Rock and Austin coming down as the major supporting players despite being in the main event, and the angle of Undertaker kidnapping Stephanie McMahon at the end of the show designed to build the next night's ratings. The show opened with a video of Rock and Austin, basically trying to portray them as being more similar than different, no doubt to lead to Rock's eventual face turn, and both being of championship caliber and deserving of the spot that only one of them can have. The Heat show opened with a graphic remembering Rick Rude, who was never referred to during the show. In an ominous switch from reality into fantasy that was strange, the open of Heat was the video showing Rock presiding over the mock funeral of Austin, which began immediately after the graphic of Rude left the screen. Heat opened with D'Lo Brown saying that he heard Sable wasn't going to be there because she was doing an acting gig, true, and challenged Val Venus to come out for a handicap match or to get a partner. Val Venus, Sean Morley, and Nicole Bass Fuchs, beat Brown, AC Connor, and Ivory, Lisa Moretti, in 143. It started as a handicap match. Bass did a run-in and gave Ivory her patented worst choke slam in wrestling and pinned her. Let's see, how can someone do a run-in and then score a pin in a match they aren't in? Well, because anything is possible. Bass told Venus he owed her and wanted him to slide his trombone into her brass section or something that would scare any male into becoming gay. I guess maybe it's really all the same thing anyway. He evidently had the same thought since he ran off. The rest of the show she was looking around backstage for him. In its own way, that angle is really funny. Draws Darren Drozdov, and Prince Albert Matt Bloom, beat Brian Christopher, Brian Lawler, and Scott Taylor in 109 when Albert press slammed and pinned Taylor with a finishing move, as called by Michael Cole, the Wadata maneuver. Thankfully Jim Ross was back calling the pay-per-view portion of the show. They bill Albert, of the famed joke we all heard as kids of asking stores if they've got Prince Albert in a can, as a friend of Droz who is a piercing expert. After the match they teased he was going to body pierce Christopher but the light went out. The Ministry came out and beat up too much as well with Viscera splashing Taylor and Undertaker predicted a horrible tragedy by the end of the night. I guess he had premonitions to how the crowd was going to react to his match. Undertaker didn't wear the trenchcoat due to the situation in Colorado. Sting was also taken out of the trenchcoat. USA Today actually had a picture of Undertaker as one of the pop culture influences that may have led to the Colorado tragedy, which the folks in WWF no doubt weren't thrilled with. That one they didn't deserve at all. Kane, Glenn Jacobs, pinned Big Boss Man, Ray Traylor, in 245 with a choke slam after Boss Man accidentally collided with Test. Test is being portrayed as being unfairly blamed for everyone else in the corporation's screw-ups, no doubt leading to a turn and an expulsion. Shane McMahon yelled at Test for screwing up after the match. This match was really bad. Viscera Nelson Frazier Jr. pinned Test, Andrew Martin, in 209. Someone should answer the question as to why Frazier has a job and Steve Williams was fired. Viscera is so huge that he missed a splash on Test and still hit him. Don't think it's a coincidence that Test used a leg drop and elbow off the top as moves that didn't work on Viscera. Bossman hit Test with the nightstick on purpose and Viscera got the pin after a pile driver. Bad, but the previous match was worse. 1. Farouk, Ron Simmons and Bradshaw, John Leafield and Midian, Dennis Knight, beat Gangrel, David Heath, and Edge, Adam Copeland, and Christian, Jay Resso, in 11:38. Christian must be one hell of a worker to get as much out of this as he did. It had no heat. Bradshaw didn't want to sell. Farouk is just there and Midian is worse than Phineas Godwin. Even 2-on-1 Bradshaw wasn't selling. The match finished with some good near falls that the crowd got into. Christian used a pescado but Farouk caught him. Edge knocked him down with a baseball slide kick through the ropes. Viscera ran in and ran into Christian and threw him into the ring where Bradshaw pinned him after a scary clothesline. 1.25 stars. 2. Al Snow, Alan Sarvin, won the hardcore title from Bob Holly, Robert Howard, in 1527. Snow bled from the onset after being hit in the head with the title belt. Holly used a jug of water. Snow did a moonsault off the barricade on the floor and hit Holly in the chest with the water jug. Snow used a hockey stick. Big pop when Snow pulled out the table. They went backstage with the same stuff they always do backstage, ending up outside in the TV truck and a trash bin. Snow hip-tossed Holly off the TV truck onto the roof of a car. They finally got back in the ring for the finish. Holly used a top rope superplex through the table for the big spot and both sold it. Holly got his arm on Snow finally but Snow kicked out. Snow then grabbed the head and used a head shot to the chest for the pin. 2.25 stars. 3. Godfather Charles Wright retained the IC title pinning Goldust, Dustin Runnels, in 5:21. Blue Meanie was back with Goldust now calling him Mommy. Meanie did a Sable imitation. Match was pretty bad although Goldust was trying harder than their TV match since he was blamed for the title change on Raw being far worse than this match was. Finish saw Meanie give Goldust powder. Godfather grabbed Goldust's hand and the powder went into his eyes, blinding him. Ross actually called him Ray Charles. Goldust couldn't see so beat up Meanie who he thought was Godfather including used Shattered Dreams on him. Meanie then fell down on Goldust with a low headbutt. Godfather then used his patented worst Death Valley driver in wrestling finisher. 1/4 star. 4. New Age Outlaws, Monty Sopp and Brian James, defeated Owen Hart and Jeff Jarrett in 10:33 in a match where the winner was to challenge Kane and X-Pac for the tag titles at the UPN special. Theirs on April 29th. Deborah came out in a black bikini, and most of the match was based on teasing she was going to take her top off. They've done one thing really smart. In using puppies as the metaphor for tits, they got fans to loudly chant "Show your puppies," which is a lot less controversial than the former chant started at ECW. Solid match ending when Billy pinned Hart after his famouser. Billy pulled down his trunks giving everyone his panties shot, which probably isn't the panties shot the majority of the audience was looking for. 2.5 stars. 5. Mankind, Michael Foley, beat the Big Show, Paul White, in 7:40 in the Boiler Room match. Unlike the previous incarnation of such a match, this didn't appear to have been pre-taped. Mankind killed himself again to get the match over. He took a header over a table. He was put in a shopping cart and taken for a dangerous ride. He was slammed on wood. They broke glass over each other with Mankind bleeding bad from the hand and Show from the head. I guess after seeing 2020, the WWF realized that they weren't cutting edge as far as giving kids the ultimate in stupid things to learn to copy, so now kids who want to be Mick Foley can break glass windows over each other to become cool to their friends. Match ended when Mankind used a low blow with a pipe, and then a zillion pipes fell down and buried Show. Mankind got out the door to win. Bossman and Test both attacked Mankind and Show got out from under the pipes. Bossman threw Test to Show who decked him and chased Bossman. Mankind then put the Socko Claw on Test. 3.25 stars. 6. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, pinned X-Pac, Sean Waltman, in 1919. It was interesting on the Heat show when Jim Ross interviewed X-Pac. He called him Sean. This was a good match, but most opinions were it fell below expectations. Really, Triple H didn't do a lot. X-Pac took a tremendous bump to the floor and started selling the neck big after missing a Bronco Buster. Jim Ross did an excellent job of selling the neck injury, but since the fans in the building couldn't hear his commentary, the heat wasn't at the level Ross was selling the match at, and fans into immediate action aren't, for better or worse, into long matches with old-time psychology. Most of the match saw Chyna and Triple H work on the neck. X-Pac blocked a pedigree and started a brief comeback, but was flipped to the floor. X-Pac went for a baseball slide, but wound up knocking out ref Mike Chioda. He delivered the X-Factor, but no ref. Chyna ran in and delivered a low blow and a reverse DDT and put Triple H on top. The lights went out and Kane showed up delivering a choke slam first to Triple H and a second to Chyna, which got a big pop. X-Pac recovered and did the Bronco Buster on both, but in getting off Chyna, Triple H used the pedigree on him for the pin. 2 3/4 stars. 7. Undertaker Mark Calloway pinned Ken Shamrock in 1850. The crowd was dead. This was actually a really great match had it been held in another place. The story of the match was that Shamrock continually made smooth moves into submissions on the leg to keep Undertaker on the ground. The problems were twofold. WWF fans don't know submissions and don't pop for moves that haven't been sold on television. Shamrock's cool knee bars and ankle cranks and arm bars out of UFC haven't been pushed in prior Shamrock matches, so fans were chanting boring loudly as the potential finishers were being used. Again, the crowd live didn't have the benefit of Ross to explain the moves. The match pretty well died live. The other reason this match didn't get over is that nobody at any point believed Undertaker would ever submit, since top guys never do. This match would have played great in Japan. But in the US, to WWF fans, it was a lengthy series of wrist holds. Undertaker did a high kick that seemed to cross Shamrock's headlights. Shamrock came back with his Hurricane Rana. Shamrock used the Fujiwara armbar into an ankle lock, but Undertaker blocked the move. He got the ankle lock again. There was a mild pop for the ankle lock because fans recognized the move, but not a big pop because it was clear nobody believed it would work on Undertaker. Also, Undertaker as a heel did none of his sit-up spots, which is really all people want to see out of him. With Undertaker in the move, Bradshaw came out with a baseball bat and Shamrock punched him. He went back to the ankle, but Paul Bearer jumped on the apron. Shamrock used the belly-to-belly and went for a tombstone piledriver, but Undertaker reversed it for the pin and left him laying. After the match, Bradshaw hit the ring and hit Shamrock with the bat, gave him a powerbomb and choked him out using a baseball bat. 1 3/4 stars. 8. Steve Austin Steve Williams retained the WWF title, pinning Rock Dwayne Johnson in 1707 to retain the WWF title. Earlier in the show, Shane McMahon had vowed on the name of his beloved grandfather Vince Sr. that if Austin had Rock pinned, he would count fairly. Vince was mad, but Stephanie assured everyone that if Shane used Vince Sr.'s name, he'd be fair. This, of course, guaranteed he wouldn't. All this storyline stuff was very well done, although Vince is kind of hard to take, going from the ultimate heel to the ultimate father with almost no transition period. This was probably the match WrestleMania should have been, as these two killed themselves taking hard bumps outside the ring. Rock's gyno is starting to return. Much of the match was outside the ring, with them destroying everything in their path. They each were whip knocking over the cyclone fencing for the light standards, and everything came tumbling down. Austin appeared to hurt his wrist or hand on it. Austin suplexed Rock on the floor, leading to Rock taking out the fence Austin hadn't already taken out. Austin clotheslined Rock on the knocked-down fence and, in following through, appeared to hit his head on the fence. His knee brace also came loose in the melee. Rock took a bump into a guardrail. Austin used a clothesline off a speaker. Austin jumped off a case, but Rock punched him. They got back to the ring area and Rock took a bump out of the ring and Austin clotheslined him off the apron. Rock used a low blow and a rock bottom through the dreaded Spanish announcer's table. Austin took a header over the barricade and may have hurt his knee in the process. Rock took a camera and began filming, but Austin got up and flipped him off and used a stunner through the English table with cameras and monitors and announcers flying everywhere. Finally they got in the ring. Austin went for a stunner, but Rock shoved him off and he crashed into Shane. Rock used the rock bottom on Austin but then collapsed himself. Shane, who had been calling it fairly except for one spot where he grabbed a chair from Austin and threw it to Rock when they were outside, then put Rock's hand over Austin's body and began counting, but Austin kicked out. Shane grabbed the belt and went to hit Austin, but of course accidentally hit Rock. Austin covered him, but Shane walked out, refusing to count. Vince and Earl Hebner came to the ring, with Vince decking Shane with the Austin WWF title belt. Rock hit Austin with the other belt and Hebner ran in, but Austin kicked out. Austin then hit the stunner, followed by a shot with the belt, and Hebner counted 3. After the match, Vince came to ringside with Austin's belt and didn't hand him the belt, but put it on the mat for Austin to pick up and celebrate. The Ministry then went backstage to where Vince's limo was with Stephanie there. Why doesn't he just take her to France like Eric did with his daughter? And the cops told the driver to drive away. Stephanie didn't want to leave until her dad came back, and then as the show ended, it was Undertaker driving. 4 1/4 stars. Whatever decisions that were going to be made that would determine the future direction of the Ultimate Fighting Championships were averted as the scheduled hearing before the Nevada State Athletic Commission was canceled at the 11th hour. The cancellation, according to both UFC promoter Bob Marowitz and Nevada State Commission Executive Director Mark Ratner, was due to questions certain members of the commission had regarding the show after viewing tapes. The decision was made that several commission members will attend the planned July 18th pay-per-view show, which will take place under commission jurisdiction in Iowa. The May 7th show coincides with a boxing event in Las Vegas, and that UFC would then get an emergency hearing before the commission a few weeks later. The delay pretty well makes it impossible for UFC to stage its September 17th pay-per-view in Las Vegas, as was the original timetable. Even if UFC were to be approved in August, there would be at least a 90-day period before the company would receive a promoter's license, so in a best-case scenario, the earliest a show could be run in Las Vegas would be mid to late November. UFC was hoping the combination of commission approval and the ability to hold the show in Las Vegas would result in a turnaround of their fortunes as far as being able to be carried on pay-per-view by the major MSOs. Marowitz had brought referee John McCarthy and Dr. Richard Istrico to Las Vegas for the scheduled hearing on April 23. The previous night, Marowitz and his lawyer, who works closely with the commission along with Ratner, had a discussion where questions the commission had were brought to attention, combined with health problems of one of the commission members who couldn't attend the meeting, which also discussed and then voted down open scoring, fans and fighters being able to see judges scoring at the end of every round as opposed to just at the completion of the fight in the wake of some very questionable scoring of recent major fights. It was agreed the best thing would be to have the commission at ringside and see a show from start to finish. Ratner noted that the commission members are not familiar with UFC, being largely boxing people, and they had a lot of questions regarding the non-boxing aspects of the sport. Art Davie, a former UFC matchmaker and at one point a co-owner in the early days of the event, who at one point was planning on attending the hearing to speak out against approval of UFC, did not attend and during the week had sent the commission a letter saying he wasn't going to attend. There were no messages other than extreme disappointment in the camp of WCW after the ratings for April 26 told the same story. Despite coming off its best Nitro in months the previous week, and following it up with 3 title changes in one show, including 2 World Heavyweight title changes, Nitro's audience dropped greatly in the third hour, and from recent weeks, and was handily beaten again by Raw's soap opera. The final figures were a 5.99 rating, 5.84 first hour, 6.14 seconds hour, and 8.9 share for Raw, slightly down from previous weeks, while Nitro delivered a 3.89 rating, 4.36 first hour, 3.89 seconds hour, 3.46 third hour, and a 5.9 share. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 5 minutes, Nitro did a 3.68 rating, so it lost head-to-head by 2.31 points. There was only one close period, which would be the one expected. WCW, knowing how much damage had been done in recent weeks to its unopposed first hour, tried loading it up this week with a lot of Roddy Piper and Ric Flair interviews and vignettes respectively, and made the point that a Page vs. Sting title match would begin before 9 p.m., having the Sting-Page match start before the hour, wound up with Nitro dropping from a 5.09 final quarter unopposed down to a 4.92, or basically about 190,000 viewers, as opposed to the usual 2 million viewers that switch when Raw starts. Raw opened with a 5.31 rating for the opening confrontation with Shane McMahon and Rock to set up their singles match. It was never close again, with major embarrassments like a Kevin Nash interview segment at 3.27, losing to the McMahon/Austin in-ring confrontation at 6.33, and the Hulk Hogan surgery segment at 3.37, losing to Mankind and Big Show vs. Bossman and Test at 6.29. The biggest embarrassment of all was after Sting and Page had literally torn the house down with a world title change with a clean climactic finish which went 1954 and almost totally kept the television audience from the usual pattern of switching. They sent Sting and Page out along with Goldberg and Nash for a 4-way world title match where Page regained the title with the help of Savage, and it only did a 3.33 rating and a 3.62 overrun. That figure is also misleading because it had an unopposed minute plus at the end, so it was probably still at a realistic head-to-head 3.33 level, compared to the Raw angle where Austin saved the day and Vince got Stephanie back doing a 6.31 final quarter and a 6.805 minute overrun. In comparing the head-to-head Monday night audience for April 26, Raw drew 6,748,000 viewers to Nitro's 4,215,500. Breaking them down by age group, in men 18 to 24, Raw drew 628,000 viewers to Nitro's 266,500, 70% Raw, Men 25 to 54 Raw drew 1,853,000 viewers to Nitro's 1,503,000. 55% Raw. Men 55 plus saw Raw draw 459,000 to Nitro's 454,000. 50.3% Raw. Women 18 to 24 had Raw with 271,000 viewers and Nitro with 137,500. 66% Raw. Women 25 to 54 had Raw with 908,000 viewers and Nitro with 605,500. 60% Raw. Women 55 plus saw Nitro win its only demo group with 381,000 viewers to 171,000 for Raw. 69% Nitro. Instead of a new slogan being "It's out there," Nitro's new slogan should be "Your grandmother's favorite wrestling show." With 2 to 11-year-olds, the group Vince doesn't want to watch that show. Raw drew 1,038,000 viewers to Nitro's 471,500, 69% Raw. I guess Vince just needs to make it more clear that kids shouldn't be watching. With ages 12 to 17, Raw drew 1,420,000 viewers to Nitro's 395,500, 78% Raw. By percentage, the Raw 17 and under audience was 36% of its total audience this week and 39% for the month of April, so those 70% adult figures you see quoted by Titan officials in newspaper articles are a little bit inflated. The other ratings for the week for WWF saw Sunday Night Heat at 3.98, far lower than usual, Livewire at 1.6 and Superstars at 1.9. The La Femme Nikita episode, which featured Val Venus, did a 2.0 rating, which meant Venus did nothing to help the show's rating, particularly since a second Nikita episode that immediately followed without Venus in a later time slot climbed to a 2.2. It probably wasn't the best night, since it was the night of a WWF pay-per-view show that went head-to-head for a wrestler to help a USA Network program in the ratings. WCW Thunder drew a 3.27 rating, which is below what it traditionally does, but is actually its best rating in at least 5 weeks. It should be noted that for whatever this is worth, that Hogan and Flair had been used in the main events on Thunder episodes in recent weeks that were doing in the 3.1 range for live shows. This week, for a taped show and using Kidman, Benoit, Malenko, Mysterio Jr., Raven and Saturn as the main event, the rating was actually up, not by a big margin, but still up. Goldberg was on the show. This isn't to suggest WCW remove the wrestlers they are putting on top and replace them with the aforementioned names, because they'd probably get killed worse doing so, but it shows how much the star power doesn't mean to the Thursday ratings. WCW Saturday Night this weekend did a 1.9. Japanese television rundown. April 10th, New Japan. This was a 90-minute show from the Tokyo Dome card earlier that day. 1. Masahiro Chono no contest Atsushi Onita in 16:10 in a no-rope explosive barbed wire match. Great Sasuke did the color commentary. The match was put together pretty well to show that Chono could beat Onita at will, but somehow didn't. He grabbed a guillotine and just let Onita go early. Onita used this Thunderfire powerbomb finisher and Chono easily kicked out at 1. Chono used the SDF and also let Onita go. The first explosion was Chono throwing a chair at Onita and him moving so the chair hit the barbed wire. The two didn't work together well at all. Chono was whipped into the barbed wire for the next explosion. Onita missed a tackle and wound up getting blown up and gashed his arm deep. This was really sick. Onita used a chair to the head and a power bomb for a near fall. Chono kicked Onita into the barbed wire, but there was no explosion. Chono, Onita and the War Ref all went into the barbed wire, but there was a weak explosion for this key spot. Masao Hattori ran into Ref. Onita and Chono both went into the barbed wire and were selling the double knockout. Onita actually got up before the 10 count and then went down again. Hattori had to pretend not to see it. -1/4 star. 2. Koji Kanemoto retained the IWGP Junior title, pinning Shinjiro Otani in 27:03. They only aired the final 6:30 of the match on television. It's hard to rate. The match didn't have a lot of heat, but that's not a surprise because these type of matches don't play well in the Dome. They did the big moves one after the other and it was really good. Kanemoto used a figure 4 ankle lock, which seems to be an innovation. Otani used his spider bomb spinning power bomb for a near fall, but the second time he tried it, Kanemoto turned it into a Hurricane Rana. Kanemoto used another ankle lock, but Otani kicked him in the head to break it. They traded more near falls until Kanemoto used a tiger suplex followed by a moonsault for the pin. 3 3/4. 3. Kensuke Sasaki and Shiro Koshinaka retained the IWGP Tag Team titles, beating Genichiro Tenryu and Tatsumi Fujinami in 17:13. The final 5 minutes aired on television. It was better than I was led to believe, particularly Sasaki and Tenryu chopping the hell out of each other. Fujinami looked sad in that he knows what to do and tries to do it, but physically he's a step slow on everything. Koshinaka used a power bomb on Fujinami while Sasaki used a Northern Lights bomb on Tenryu, but Fujinami kicked out of the first pin. Koshinaka delivered a second power bomb for the pin. 2.5 stars. 4. Keiji Muto retained the IWGP Heavyweight title, beating Don Frye in 12-16. New Japan's audience is getting totally Americanized as both Frye and Onita were pelted with garbage like crazy as they walked to the ring. Muto jumped Frye at the bell with 2 drop kicks and a backbreaker and moonsault to set up an ankle lock. Frye came back working on the knee and hamstring to set up his own ankle lock. Muto gave 3 dragon screws to set up a figure 4 and a rope break spot. Frye came back with punches and a choke, and when Muto made the ropes, Frye wouldn't break, and Hattori had to drag him off Muto. He went back to the choke, but Muto flipped him out. Muto came back with a series of headbutts and a dragon screw, and as he went for the figure 4, Frye nailed him with a punch, which was a great spot. Frye got the mount and began pounding away when Muto caught the arm in an armbar. Muto must be a hell of a worker to carry Frye to a match this good. 3 stars. April 11th, All Japan. This show aired 4 matches from various cities during the Carnival Tour. 1. Kenta Kobashi pinned Jun Akiyama in 24-37. This was edited down to 6:30, and at least based on what aired it was a super match. Kobashi was working on one leg, but Akiyama carried things and the heat was super, particularly when Akiyama would make comebacks and hit the exploder. Kobashi ended up using a sleeper, then taking Akiyama over with a German suplex from that position on Akiyama's head. He went for a lariat but was hit with another exploder. Akiyama went for another exploder but was hit with a desperation lariat and pinned. Judging from the heat, I'd presume this match would be even better in its original form. 4.25 stars. 2. Vader pinned Gary Albright in 7:23. These two didn't work well together, even though they actually had a history in the old UWFI promotion. The fans were into Albright suplexing Vader, but it wasn't good. Vader splashed Albright for the pin, but Albright kicked out, which basically made it look real bad. Only 90 seconds aired. 3. Mitsuharu Misawa beat Takao Omori in 12-16. Only 2 minutes aired, but the crowd was really into it, so it was probably a hot match. Omori messed up a spot just before the Tiger Driver finish. 4. Kobashi and Vader went to a 30 minutes draw. The final 11 minutes aired, and you have to give them credit since this was a super match and Vader is awfully large to work a 30 minutes match, and Kobashi was supposed to be crippled and unable to perform. Kobashi missed a moonsault and Vader delivered 2 splashes. Kobashi dropkicked the knee and used an ankle lock and later a knee bar. Both men traded released German suplexes in the closing minutes. Based on what aired, this appeared to be one of those grueling All Japan classics. It's hard to say how good this would or wouldn't be unedited, since 30 minutes is a long time for a Vader singles match, but All Japan matches are traditionally much better when viewed in their entirety than watching an edited version of the second half or less by itself. 4 stars. Mexico. The biggest news is that Felino jumped from CMLL to AAA and debuted on April 18, teaming with Latin Lover and Pero Aguayo in the main event, beating El Texano and Sangre Chicana and Espectro Jr. on the same shows. The Juniors, La Parca Jr. and Mascara Sagrada Jr. and Pero Aguayo Jr. and Blue Demon Jr. beat Los Vados Locos, Mayflowers and Charlie Manson, Enigma and Picudo to win the National Atomicosh 4-man team title. Mascara Sagrada beat Pirata Morgan in a mask versus hair match on April 21 in Aguascalientes. Great Sasuke is going to be coming to Naucalpan to work a Dragon Gym show in May. The main event on the April 23 Arena Coliseo show in Mexico City was Dr. Wagner Jr. and Ultimo Guerrero and Scorpio Jr. versus Negro Casas and Mr. Niebla and T. Nieblas Jr. They did an angle before the match. Ref Roberto Rangel, who cost Scorpio Jr. his mask a few weeks back, came with Niebla to visit Rayo de Jalisco Jr. at rehab for a neck injury. Wagner, Zumbito and Scorpio all were hiding at the rehab center. Earlier, Scorpio had gone and somehow got the venom out of a real-life scorpion and tried to stick Rangel with a needle containing the venom. The match ending saw Scorpio have Casas pinned, but Rangel called a DQ foul. In this angle, Rangel is actually a face ref who is constantly screwing the heels. April 30th in Tijuana has Scorpio Jr. and Bestia Salvaje versus Casas and Atlantis in a tournament with Universo 2000, Mascara Ano 2000, Mil Mascaras, Fantasma, Phobia, Brazo de Plata, Pirata Morgan, Pierroth Jr., Cien Caras and Super Astro along with probably a nondescript scrub, who will end up losing where the losers advance and the ultimate loser drops either his mask or his hair. April 18th in Naucalpan saw an interesting unmasking. It started as a Increíbles, Rudo and Técnico on each team, tag match where Rafi El Salsero and El Matador beat Bombero, Infernal and Fireman. This meant Bombero would put his hair up against the mask of Fireman. Fireman lost, revealing unknown Raul Fernandez of Mexico City. What is interesting is that Fireman is actually in real life the head of the firefighters for a national Mexican company. Black Warrior retained the NWA light heavyweight title, beating Olympico on April 21st in Acapulco. Brazo de Platino and Brazo Cibernetico and Super Brazo beat Los Bestias Negras in a match where all three losers had their heads shaved on April 21st in Celaya. After their All Japan tour, Headhunters have returned to Mexico. Pero Aguayo Jr. and Sr. retained the national tag titles, beating Sangre Chicana and El Texano on April 20th in Leon. April 30th in Querétaro will be a cage match with Los Payasos vs Los Vados Locos, where the last man left in the cage gets his mask removed or head shaved. Virus and Rafael Salcero leave for a tour of Japan for Super Delphins Osaka Pro Wrestling this week as the two unknown Mexican wrestlers. Rayo de Jalisco Jr. was told by doctors that he needs to lose 30 to 40 pounds and shouldn't return to the ring until at least November due to his neck injuries. La Fiera is scheduled to return on May 14th after suffering an ankle injury in November. Ringo Mendoza, defending the CMLL middleweight title against Blue Panther, headlined the April 27th Arena Coliseo show, which also had a hair versus hair match with Kid Guzman versus Americo Rocca. Astro Rey Jr. kept the Mexican national welterweight title, beating El Hijo del Gladiador in the April 25th Arena Coliseo main event, with the fans throwing money afterwards as a sign that it was a great match. Something you'll never hear on American television. There was a match on the AAA TV show that aired April 25th on Galavision between Connect vs Cibernetico. A third juiced-up guy did a run-in. Announcer Arturo Rivera sounded resigned and said basically, everyone in wrestling on anabolic steroids? Just like that Cuban guy, a knock on Conan, who just about everyone in power in AAA hates. Pena is also debuting a new character called Axel, doing a Val Venus porn star gimmick, hence the 3 X's in his name. All Japan. Very little this week as they are just preparing for the May 2nd Tokyo Dome show. The following tour from May 23rd to June 11th will have Vader, Johnny Ace, Bart Gunn, Wolf Hockfield, Giant Kimala2 and George Hines, Jackie Fulton, formerly the Eagle under a mask with this group, who formed a tag team with the Patriot. Steve Williams is expected to ask for his job back at the Dome show. There is no indication one way or another on the odds of this. He had signed a 3-year contract with the WWF, which has well over 2 years remaining. He has a meeting scheduled with the WWF after the Dome show on discussing terms for a contract release. New Japan. Things remain pretty slow on this tour. The biggest angle is that Masahiro Chono and Don Fry started teaming together in 6-man main events on April 24th in Beppu. This also elevated Fry's real-life friend but pro wrestling rival Brian Johnston into main event status. The angle they are doing is that Johnston is currently with the New Japan team, but Keiji Muto is trying to recruit Johnston into his Wolfpack-type unit. April 24th was also the 10th anniversary of the Jushin Liger gimmick, which debuted exactly 10 years earlier at a Tokyo Dome show. At the April 21st house show in Kumamoto, Chono formally introduced Fry as his new partner after shooting the mini angle at the April 10th Dome show. As a publicity stunt, Chono has talked about forming a trio on a big show with Fry and Dennis Rodman. There is nothing to this because without pay-per-view, New Japan can't afford the type of price tag Rodman would charge. Shinya Hashimoto, who has been out of action since getting killed in the shoot, and at this point I'm pretty darn sure it was a shoot, by Naoya Ogawa, has dropped 45 pounds. The best of the Super Junior tournament, which looks to be the weakest in history, announced its lineup. The round-robin matches are May 19th to June 6th, with the A Group winner and B Group winner facing for the title on June 8th at Budokan Hall. A group has Jushin Liger, Koji Kanemoto, Tatsuhito Takaiwa, Gran Hamada, Masaaki Mochizuki, and Shocker. B Group has El Samurai, Shinjiro Otani, Kendo Kashin, Masao Orihara, Minoru Tanaka and Dr. Wagner Jr. There will be one A Group match and one B Group match every night of the tour. Most of the shows are in smaller cities. May 21st at Korakuen Hall has Takaiwa vs Mochizuki and Kashin vs Tanaka. May 23rd in Nagano has Liger vs Mochizuki and Samurai vs Tanaka. May 31st in Osaka has Liger vs Kanemoto and Otani vs Tanaka. June 3rd in Hiroshima has Kanemoto vs Hamada and Samurai vs Otani. Other Japan notes. The Frank Shamrock vs Kiyoshi Tamura match on April 23 at Osaka Furitsu Gym drew a reported 3,870, which is a disappointment, which again speaks of the reality of life after Maeda in rings. The match, which was a shoot, went to a 20 minutes draw finishing with a 1-1 score. Shamrock scored his point early on an armbar and lost a point by getting a yellow card for an illegal strike. Tamura went into a defensive mode after losing the first point quickly. Shamrock was very impressed with Tamura's defense on the ground and in particular, his low kicks, which Shamrock said were more powerful than those of Boss Rutan. Apparently Rings made a slight rules modification in regard to now being allowed to strike on the ground if both knees of the striker are touching the ground. With one knee on the ground it's allowable. Shamrock was told of the rules about an hour before his fight and made the mistake in combat. There is talk of rematching the two in September, as apparently this was a very good match. It's the first match under any rules that Shamrock hasn't won in more than 2 years, a streak that has encompassed 8 matches, mainly against world-class athletes, under many different formats. Also in a major upset, Gilbert Yvel of Holland destroyed Tsuyoshi Kosaka in what was also a shoot. Yvel, who is a very exciting Muay Thai specialist who has the best kickboxing coach in Europe and maybe the world, had studied how to avoid Kosaka's takedowns and keep the fight standing. With Kosaka unable to take him down, he was hammered and bloodied up badly, with a 1.5-inch cut that needed 11 stitches to close. We've been told the match probably should have been stopped earlier, but they wanted to give Kosaka the chance to win before finally the doctor stopped it at 1958. Most, if not all the matches on the show were shoots. The next Rings is May 22nd. Tom Erickson, the former U.S. Super Heavyweight Freestyle Wrestling Champion, is set to debut on the show. Joop Kasteel was the name asked to be his opponent, but Kasteel has yet to accept. Rings is going to have trouble at the gate. Unfortunately, the more it gets toward shooting and away from worked, more dramatic matches. Toryumon ran its second tour of Japan this past week, drawing a sellout reported as 2,259 fans headlined by a 6-man tag with Judo Suwa and Sumo Fuji and Shima Nobunaga beating Magnum Tokyo and Dragon Kid and Kenichiro Arai in more than 30 minutes. They also ran 2 shows on April 25th in Kawasaki. On the second show, Judo Suwa beat Dragon Kid to win the NWA welterweight title. The title change was done because Kid came into the tour with a bad shoulder injury. After the match it was announced he would be having major surgery to repair it, which I believe was scheduled for April 28th, and would be out for 1 year. The next Toryumon tour of Japan will be in July. LLPW wrestler Yasha Kurenai, 29, will have her retirement match on July 20th. She's retiring after a 9.5-year career because she's getting married. Candy Akutsu, Ayako Hamada of Fujita, and Mika Akinoa version taped a CD, reminiscent of the old days of Japanese women wrestling where they would try and market the pretty young girls in the promotion as pop star singers. Shoichi Funaki is returning to Michinoku Pro Wrestling on the next tour to both feud with and team with Taka Michinoku on a Star from April 29th to May 9th. Great Sasuke vs Sasuke the Great, Masao Orihara, headlines May 9th in I Wait for Michinoku Pro. They will be doing a Masked Man tournament with Sasuke, Daskaris, Brand Naniwa, Tiger Mask and Superboy among others in the summer. Michinoku Pro ran its biggest show thus far this year on April 27th at Tokyo Ota Ward Gym. We don't have an attendance at press time, but Jinsei Shinzaki pinned Sasuke in 21:35 with a powerbomb in the main event before 2107. All Japan wrestlers Satoru Asako, Masamichi Marufuji and Yoshinobu Kanemaru worked in the semi along with Toryumon's Magnum Tokyo, Kenichiro Arai and Yasushi Kanda and battlers Yuki Ishikawa and Takashi Hijikata and Neo ladies wrestlers Shaparita Asari and Saya Endo. Shinzaki beat Sasuke several years ago in a famous match in the same building in the match that really made Shinzaki's career. Big Japan runs the men's Teo vs Abdullah the Butcher singles match it has been building toward on April 29th in Shizuoka. Battlers on June 9th with present a memorial show for Masami Soranaka. Soranaka, the son-in-law of Karl Gotch, was one of the original bookers for the first UWF which started the work-shoot movement in Japan of which Battlers is a descendant of. He was a very well-liked man in Japan who passed away 7 years ago. Kaoru Ito, without the Zappai gimmick, will challenge Yumiko Hata for the WWA title probably at the Fuji TV studios for a TV taping in July. Battlerts on May 14th at the Big Show at Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center will have Yuki Ishikawa vs Mitsuhiro Matsunaga in a bed of nails outside the ring match, Bob Backlund vs Daisuke Ikeda, Alexander Otsuka and Mohamed Yone vs Hayabusa and Tetsuhiro Kuroda, Minoru Tanaka vs Naoki Sano, who has been getting killed in shoots as Yui Sano, Tiger Mask and Ikuto Hidaka vs Grand Naniwa and Mach Junji and several others. Backlund worked April 26 at Korakuen Hall for this group, teaming with Mohamed Yone to beat Ishikawa and Carl Greco on a show headlined by Ikeda beating Otsuka and Great Sasuke keeping the NWA middleweight title, beating Tanaka. Both LLPW and GIA ran April 25 at Korakuen Hall. The GIA show drew a legit full house of 2,000 with the gimmick of Chigusa Nagayo having to wrestle in the opener because the company is being run by Lioness Asuka. Nagayo beat Kaori Nakayama in 35 seconds. Asuka then came out and challenged Nagayo's protege, Sonoko Kato, and won in 32 seconds, saying she won quicker than Nagayo. Main event saw Asuka and Mayumi Ozaki and Mima Shimoda over Kaoru and Meiko Satomura and Kato. LLPW drew about a 3/4 hour, estimated at 1,500, as Asuka and Eagle Sawai and Shark Tsuchiya lost their LLPW 6 ladies belts to Norio Tadano and Harley Saito and Keiko Aono. They also did a gimmick where Shinobu Kondori faced Aya Koyama. She beat her in 49 seconds with an arm bar. Koyama challenged for an immediate rematch and Kondori won with an ankle lock in 2:09. She challenged again, and this time Kondori pinned her in 2:49. Super Delphin, who won the CMLL welterweight title from Olympico, defends on the current Osaka Pro Wrestling Tour against Rafael Salcero on April 28 at Korakuen Hall. Dr. Luther, Len St. Clair, who was a cult figure for FMW many years back, will return for Atsushi Onita's May 13 show at Korakuen Hall, which is headlined by Onita and Samba Asako and Isao Takagi vs Ichiro Yaguchi and Shoji Nakamaki and Genichiro Tenryu. Longtime Indiana promoter Mike Samples will be headed to Big Japan to work for Shinya Kojika doing death matches. Former wrestler and manager Ikamasa KY Shogun Wakamatsu was elected to the Municipal Assembly in his home city of Shibutsu on April 26. He is expected to return to wrestling now, doing an angle for the May 14 Battlerts show in Sapporo. Here and there. The Cauliflower Alley Club held its annual national banquet on April 24 in Newton, Iowa, the site of the Amateur and Pro Wrestling Museum, in conjunction with inductions to a new Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame set up by Lou Thesz and Mike Chapman. The first inductees were Thesz Strangler Lewis, George Tragos, Frank Gotch, and Vern Gagne. Thesz, whom the Hall of Fame is named after, is the man who picks the inductees based on being successful pros, but they also have to have been great real wrestlers. The museum is filled with a ton of old pro wrestling memorabilia. For older fans who have old memorabilia on pro wrestling that they think would be great for a pro wrestling wing of a museum, you can contact Mike or Bev Chapman at the museum at 515-791-1517. Among those attending the weekend affairs included Gagne, Thesz, Dick Bayer, Ella Waldeck, Ida Mae Martinez, Bob Geigel, Tom Andrews, Ole Anderson, Harley Race, Red Bastian, Stan Kowalski, Mad Dog Vachon, Kenny J., Dick Hutton, Danny Hodge, and Tiger Conway Jr. There are actually two different bills pertaining to rules and regulation of pro wrestling in Oregon under discussion. Senate Bill 238, which we spoke of last week, would eliminate drug testing on nationally touring groups, which the Rose Garden, the local arena in Portland where WWF and WCW haven't run, is behind. Spokespeople for Congressman Gary George, who initiated this legislation, weren't even aware that there was local wrestling in Oregon when contacted about how the bill was worded would continue drug testing for local groups but not for the national groups. It will likely be amended to where it pertains to all pro wrestling in Oregon so as not to create a ridiculous double standard. Senate Bill 948 would deregulate pro wrestling as under the jurisdiction of the Boxing and Wrestling Commission and instead put it under the jurisdiction of the Police Department, which is behind this bill. This has gotten a good deal of local publicity, including a front-page story in the Oregonian which was pretty much straightforward, a column by sports columnist Dwight Janes opposing regulation of pro wrestling, and an editorial on April 24 against the introduction of the new laws, asking why the laws should be changed just because the big companies don't want to abide by the current laws. It should be noted that the Oregon Commission does not test for steroids, which is a common misconception. Ric Flair has been added to the list of attendees to the Brian Pillman Memorial Show on May 19 at the Cincinnati Gardens. Also appearing as guests are Rick Steamboat, Woman, and Brian Hildebrand. The top matches are Chris Benoit and Dean Malenko vs. Conan and Rey Mysterio Jr. with Hildebrand as referee, Mankind vs. D'Lo Brown, Road Dogg vs. Al Snow, Terry Taylor vs. Tom Pritchard and Bullpain vs. Rob Conway. The original Buddy Rogers, Charles Rogers, a silent screen matinee idol best known for being the husband of screen legend Mary Pickford, died on April 21 at his home in Rancho Mirage, California at the age of 94. We had many times incorrectly stated that the famous wrestler Buddy Rogers, who passed away in 1992, had gotten his name from comic strip and science fiction character Buck Rogers. He actually got his name from the man who passed away this past week and had been on record as saying so. During the 1950s, when the wrestler came to California, the actor went to court and obtained a temporary restraining order prohibiting him from wrestling under the name Buddy Rogers. Rogers instead wrestled as Nature Boy Rogers and was never called Buddy on television. In the late 50s, the wrestler returned to California and he was referred to as Buddy Rogers. Next Memphis house show is May 7th at the New Daisy Theater. Since Jerry Lawler won the tag titles by himself, he picked Bill Dundee to be his championship partner and defended on TV against Derek King and Kid Wicked. King left the building before the match, so Wicked said he's faced them by himself. Steve Bradley then agreed to be Wicked's partner, but Lawler and Dundee won. Stan Lane and Steve Kieran were at the studios and turned heel and insulted the new fans. The show ended with a battle royal with no finish and more brawling, with Lawler and Dundee versus Fabs, with the Fabs using weapons to leave them laying. There have been some minor changes for the better on the Roller Jam broadcasts, which have been broken up into two one-hour shows, one on Monday, one on Friday, and then both repeated together on Saturday at 5 p.m. Buddy Atkinson Jr., a famous skater from the 60s, has joined the broadcast team and there are more features. For whatever reason, the game itself still lacks life and intensity. Former WCW ring announcer Tony Gilliam is now working as the PA voice of the NHL Carolina Hurricanes. Speaking of mainstream sports, on May 2nd at the Philadelphia Phillies vs. Los Angeles Dodger game in Philadelphia will be a birthday party for the Philly fanatic, who is a big wrestling fan. Before the game they are going to set up a wrestling ring and have the Rock and Roll Express vs. Head Shrinkers with the Fanatic as ref. Michael Tierson, the wrestling columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News and a longtime area DJ, will manage the Fanatic. A clarification regarding the upcoming Jesse Ventura movie on NBC. Nils Allen Stewart did suffer a bad groin tear during filming, but probably 90% or more of the wrestling footage will be him playing Ventura and the rest was shot after the injury, with Mark Hamilton doing the stunts as Ventura. Jorge Maldonado, a Puerto Rican wrestler who also worked indies in the Northeast as Rockin' Rico, had his kidney removed on April 7th in Boston. He had been booking an indie group in Puerto Rico and was told he'd need a new kidney in 1997 and had been waiting for a donation, which came from his mother. Ray Gonzalez regained the WWC Universal title from Pierre Roth Jr. on April 17 in a barbed wire match in Guaynabo. Gonzalez had put his hair up against the belt. All Japan's Giant Kimala 2 is wrestling for WWC as Aki Malemba, although he may already be gone since he no-showed on April 17. He was doing a program with Glamour Boy Shane over the WWC TV title. Gonzalez met Carlos Colon with the Universal belt against the Puerto Rican belt on April 24 in Fajardo in what is billed as Colon's last shot at the belt. On April 23 in a tag match with Invader No. 1 and Pierre Roth beating Gonzalez and Chicky Star, Invader pinned Gonzalez and he also has title shots upcoming. Cleveland All Pro Wrestling on May 23 has a King of the Deathmatch tournament. For more info call 216-961-9996. Independent Championship Wrestling on May 15 in Ashley, Illinois for the Last Call Brawl. Wild World of Wrestling on May 14 in Bridgewater, New Jersey at the Raritan High School has Sergeant Slaughter, Manny Fernandez, Balls Mahoney, Tito Santana, Skull Von Crush, Little Guido, Spike Dudley and others. Icebox, a Roller Games babyface referee based on the Refrigerator Perry character, will work as a pro wrestler for All Pro Wrestling on May 1 in Pinole, California. The Brotherhood, although no longer recognized by the NWA, are still wrestling as NWA World Tag Team Champions for the NWA New England promotion. California Championship Wrestling at 760-726-4719 is looking for used championship title belts for use in their promotion. RF Video will be opening new pro wrestling merchandise stores at the Gurnee Mills Mall in Chicago on May 10 and at the Mall of America in Minneapolis on June 7. For more info on their merchandise and videotapes, you can contact them at rfvideo.com. MMA. The first major K1 show of the year took place on April 25 at Yokohama Arena before a sellout crowd of 16,800. The show, which ran head-to-head with yet another primetime giant Baba special on NTV, no rating for the Baba special, largely a one-hour tape of Baba's matches along with lots of funeral footage, with K1 on Fuji Network drew a strong 14.1 rating. There was a major upset in the main event as Francisco Filho knocked out Ernesto Hoost, considered the best technical heavyweight kickboxer in the world, at 138 in a spectacular finish. Filho had both Maurice Smith and Frank Shamrock in his corner for the fight. Mike Bernardo won a unanimous decision over Masaki Sadake, who apparently was in the best condition of his career, in a good match. Bernardo had a Japanese-style wedding on April 26 in Tokyo. Gary Goodridge's K1 debut saw him get disqualified early in the first round after throwing an accidental knee to the groin to Musashi. Musashi couldn't recover from the blow. There was some talk of sending both men out for their match later in the show, but Musashi didn't want it, and Kazuyoshi Ishii announced that the two would be rematched on June 6 in Sapporo. In the other key matches, Peter Aerts beat Matt Skelton when Skelton couldn't answer the bell at the start of the 5th round, and Andy Hug beat Ray Sefo when Sefo couldn't answer the bell for the 5th round. At one point Sefo also caught a low blow and the match was stopped for 2 minutes waiting for him to recover. Ishii said that another former UFC fighter, Jim Mullen, who was knocked out last month by Aerts, would face Sadake probably in late June or early July. A correction from last week, in the Yuki Kondo vs. Semi Schultz Pancrase title fight, the lost point in the final minute was due to Schultz accidentally throwing a kick when Kondo was down, which is illegal, and not from throwing a closed fist punch. Sanae Kikuta, a former Japanese collegiate judo champion who has done Vale Tudo matches with pride including a loss to Renzo Gracie which lasted more than 50 minutes, will debut with Pancrase as a regular on June 11. Pancrase has minor shows on May 23 in Nagoya, June 11 at Korakuen Hall, July 6 at Korakuen Hall, August 1 at Korakuen Hall, September 4 in Sendai, and the next pay-per-view show will be September 18 from Tokyo Bay NK Hall. The California State Athletic Commission has adopted an 8-member martial arts advisory board to try and create regulations for some form of mixed martial arts fighting. Chris Brennan, who was scheduled to face Sean McCulley in the opener at the May 7 UFC in Birmingham, Alabama, suffered a concussion and a cut needing 8 staples to close last week when a metal fixture at his apartment complex fell on his head and he's out of the show. McCulley then pulled out of the show as well, citing too restrictive of a contract. McCulley claimed that his contract wouldn't allow him to promote or appear on any other show for 1 year, including in pro wrestling, which he and his brother are trying to get into. He worked the last UFO show in Japan. The underneath UFC fighter's purse is only $500 to appear and another $500 to the winner, and combine that with the restrictive nature of the contracts is why it's hard to get fighters to work the undercards. The money isn't likely to change until a cable turnaround. Based on the Las Vegas debut being pushed back until November, one would think the UFC shows until that time are going to be bare bones shows. Most likely also the Frank Shamrock vs. Tito Ortiz fight, which was signed to be the Las Vegas debut, would also be pushed back. No word on a replacement match that could be put together at such a late date. I'd bet one of the dark matches will become a TV match. The July 18th UFC show, which is the one the Nevada Commission will be at, is kind of a double-edged sword. For the greater good of getting sanctioned, it is probably in their best interest to have a more skill-oriented and less dangerous show, but those type of shows aren't usually well received by fans, and having shows that aren't entertaining combined with having so few names on the show don't encourage return business. Enson Inoue's opponent on the April 29th Pride show in Nagoya will be a 310-pound karate fighter named Soichi Nishida. Pride attempted at the last minute to get Frank Shamrock to face Inoue in a rematch of their classic match in 1997, but it was way too short notice. While in Japan, K1 also contacted Shamrock about fighting for them. They're also going to have a 5-minute jiu-jitsu exhibition with Royler Gracie vs. Rickson Gracie on the show. Inoue said that he was never going to fight Naoya Ogawa. That match had been proposed because Ogawa was a pro wrestler that wasn't ready for him and he's only going to do real fights. Travis Fulton, the Iron Man of fighting, didn't get his visa on time, so he won't be going to Brazil this week for his main event on an IBC show against Carlos Barreto. Fulton, who seems to fight every week and has about 70 documented MMA matches, faces Pete Williams on the next UFC Evan Tanner, just 6 days after being knocked out in a fight he was dominating against Leon Dake on the April 18th Pancrase pay-per-view, headlined the USWF show on April 24th in Lubbock, Texas before 3,500 beating Vincent Nixon in the main event via submission to a keylock on the arm in 107 to keep his heavyweight title. Brandon McDowell won the heavyweight tournament, beating Josh Sursa in the finals at 12:41, and Eric Davila won a middleweight tournament over Eli Shelter via submission in 35 seconds of overtime after going 15 minutes. Egan Inoue, the brother of Enson Inoue, will headline the June 1st Super Brawl show at the NBC Arena in Honolulu. Super Brawl and Shooto from Japan are combining forces with 7 Shooto matches on that show with a Shooto ref under Shooto rules. Shooto's biggest star, Ruben Asado, will fight in Honolulu before the year is out. ECW. Even after a good business weekend last week, there were still a number of bounced checks during the week. The morale is generally not good for that reason. Chris Chetty was injured on April 23 in South Amboy, New Jersey, when he took a hard whip into the turnbuckles early in a match with the Dudleys and fell down and couldn't get up. He rolled out of the ring and still couldn't move and ended up going out on a stretcher. He was able to walk the next day and it is believed to have been a pinched nerve, but he may be out for a few weeks. The fans thought this was some kind of a bad angle and didn't buy it as legit because they've seen so many fake shoot injuries they don't believe anything. The next night in Queens, New York, they were shooting an angle where Chris Condito came out with a halo on and he and Tammy Sitch, who was crying, were talking about a career-ending injury and a retirement to do an angle with Taz, and nobody bought it at all. The angle basically flopped, although afterwards Condito and Steve Corino did beat Taz up enough to set up a Taz vs. Condito title match on the pay-per-view. Part of the problem, among other things, is that they just had done the same angle, which got over great the first time, with Shane Douglas on the last show in the building. Douglas looks to be out of action about 3 weeks with a hairline fracture of the ankle. The plan right now is to continue to build Douglas vs. Justin Credible for the pay-per-view. Douglas will work as much as he's able by that time, and most likely Sabu will wind up getting involved either right away, or 20 minutes later if Douglas is up to the task. The plan to keep Sabu totally away from the public was already dropped, and he continued doing run-ins at every show this weekend, which will continue up to and past the pay-per-view show. At this point it also appears that Super Crazy vs. Taka Michinoku and Yoshihiro Tajiri vs. Little Guido will be on pay-per-view. Tommy Rogers and Sid, who were both working the weekend in the area for Mike O'Brien's Northeast Wrestling, showed up at the April 24th Queens shows to get settled on previously bounced checks. Sid was owed $6,000 and Rogers a much lesser amount, and both were paid off, although there ended up being a scene between Rogers and Paul Heyman over it. Sid was telling people that the reason he no-showed the ECW arena was because of bounced checks, and also claimed that Heyman never had told him about the date and he never received plane tickets for the show. The first half of the story is clearly true since there was a bad check. The second half isn't, as he not only was sent a ticket, but also changed his ticket before not getting on the plane. They did salutes to Rick Rude at all the house shows this weekend. WWF also did so in Madison Square Garden. Taka Michinoku didn't want to do anything on the smaller shows but worked well in a singles match, losing to Jerry Lynn on the Queen show. The April 22nd show in Staten Island, New York drew 1,100, April 23rd in South Amboy, New Jersey drew 800, and April 24th in Queens, New York drew a sellout 1,000. New Jack did another balcony dive in Queens after losing to Balls Mahoney. Axel Rotten was kept off the Queens show due to a disciplinary reason. There are negotiations going on with Acclaim that would include Acclaim, besides getting video rights for an ECW game, buying a share of the company, or Acclaim loaning ECW money. Weekend TV was pretty much thrown together when the main angles shot in Buffalo were for technical reasons unairable. They are doing an angle claiming the State Athletic Commission in New York won't allow Sabu to wrestle due to an injury, and all the other states are following suit. TV matches were Rotten and Mahoney over Little Guido and Sal E. Graziano in 8:26. Match was okay, ending when Graziano got pinned after each man had delivered a chair shot to him. Joey Styles said Sal is 6'8". That means ref John Finnegan must be 6'6". They showed clips of Taka Michinoku beating Papi Chulo. Papi Chulo is a lot better when it comes to actual wrestling and poise than when he was taken off mainline WWF television. It seemed pretty good. From Buffalo, they aired the tag title change in the singles match where Devon Dudley beat Rob Van Dam. Tons of outside interference and ref bumps to the point of being past numbing. The idea was to give Van Dam an excuse for fans to see him lose, but it was so overdone that it detracted from the match itself. Bubba interfered frequently and laid out 3 refs. The crowd response to Van Dam kicking out of one near fall after another grew weaker as the match progressed, which indicates they were out there too long. Finally, Justin Credible and Lance Storm came out to help the Dudleys, and with Credible hitting Van Dam, and Sabu, who came out to help, with cane shots, it set Van Dam up for a 3D off the top rope for the pin. ECW is on Pittsburgh TV at 10:30 a.m. Saturdays on Channel 59. WCW. May 9th St. Louis pay-per-view lineup looks like Page vs. Nash for the WCW title, Sting vs. Goldberg, Flair vs. Piper, a three-way for the tag titles with Benoit and Malenko, Raven and Saturn and Mysterio Jr. and Kidman, Booker T vs. Rick Steiner, who is turning heel soon. For the TV title, Scott Steiner, whose MRI results weren't good and may need another back operation soon, versus Buff Bagwell. For the U.S. title, Gorgeous George vs. Charles Robinson, Brian Knobbs vs. Bam Bam Bigelow in a hardcore match, and Conan vs. Stevie Ray. At press time, the advance was 11,346 tickets for $426,698. Nitro on April 26 at the Fargo, North Dakota drew 11,492, 8,813 paying $240,693. I know that pro wrestling is a total farce these days, but Nitro, and to a much lesser extent Raw, are the only shows that have zero continuity. If you watch sitcoms and soap operas, they don't build something up one week, do something in the middle that makes the original thing go away, then come back the next week and pretend the week in the middle never happened. I know if you look with a microscope you can find very minor storyline snafus, but Nitro snafus are unlike anything I've ever seen on television. Witness Flair being committed for 72 hours. On Thursday's Thunder they announce he's out of the mental hospital and backstage making changes in the card. On Sunday he wrestles in Minneapolis. But on Monday, 1 week later, he's been in the nut house for the entire week and still there, running around in the same underwear like he's never left. The segment would have been stupid beyond belief except it was so entertaining because Flair is such a hoot. But in their creativity and the Scott Hall sight gag, they also took Flair, their biggest ratings draw, off the show live, and the ratings suffered down the stretch. The problem isn't the ratings suffering because Flair didn't have a match, because he shouldn't be wrestling every week on TV anyway, but the total lack of continuity. How about Randy Savage being suspended by Flair and them having a match with Gorgeous George vs. Charles Robinson where George has to win to get Savage reinstated? However, Savage works all the house shows, and then this week wrestles on Nitro. So what's the purpose of the match on the pay-per-view? Or how about Piper being fired as commissioner last week, but being back this week as commissioner and being fired again, with no explanation why his being fired last week didn't happen? This may be another set of reasons why fans haven't come back even though Nitro is presenting better wrestling than Raw. Raw has momentum and it's very hard to bring back viewers, put up with crap for months before giving up. But most people watch wrestling for the storylines these days as Nitro's holes are larger than the Grand Canyon. The show opened with Flair in an insane asylum and Charles Robinson in charge as I guess he's vice president of the company all of a sudden. Robinson tried the entire show but was clearly not ready for the spotlight on him. Piper did an interview saying he was in charge. You know, nobody but us TV viewers know Robinson is in charge. Piper only got a lukewarm reaction. He reinstated Savage, however the match is still on the pay-per-view anyway, and ordered a match against Scott Steiner. He called out Page and ordered him to face Sting at the end for the first hour. Mike Tenay, who is now on the booking committee, was out because Bobby Heenan was ill. Don't read anything more into that as Heenan will be back next week. Conan beat Bryan Adams via DQ in 5:10 when he put on the Tequila Sunrise, and the Black and White all jumped him and gave him a stuffed piledriver. Conan may have gotten a slight injury from this, reported as a possible stinger, and he was waving for a trainer to come out and help him legit while Tenay was doing a 900-line plug and they ignored it. Scott and Steve Armstrong won a handicap match over Raven in 3:56 when Scott pinned Raven after Steve hit Raven with a chair. Scott and Steve had been hitting each other constantly. The finish was a surprise anyway. Flair was in the nut house with this bald guy playing the role of a nut pretending to be a doctor. I swear it was supposed to be Gary Hart. Robinson and Piper had a confrontation. It wasn't good. Robinson slapped Piper and the security pulled Piper off from killing him. Piper was fired again. Robinson was called Little Nature Boy. Wouldn't that be the name of a mini? Sting beat Page to win the WCW title in 1954 with a Scorpion Death Drop after a ton of great near falls. Superheat. Just an excellent 4 stars match. Mysterio Jr. won the Cruiserweight title from Psicosis in 5:16 with a DDT. Good match, but nowhere close to the previous bout. Mysterio Jr. had a cast on his left wrist which was badly sprained in the 4-way last week. He did the sick Hurricane Rana off the top rope onto Psicosis, who was on the apron, and they both crashed to the floor. Benoit and Malenko destroyed Mysterio Jr. after the match and launched him into orbit. I've yet to speak to one person who can explain with any rationale why Mysterio Jr. won the belt back after only 1 week. The only answer is the one given a few weeks back when Ray and Kidman won the tag belts. It's the belief that title changes are what people want to see, so they have to constantly change titles to pick up the ratings. As you can see, title changes now are done so often nobody even knows who holds the belts, and when they don't know, the belts are rendered meaningless. These guys should understand long-term psychology of booking because it's very similar to drug addictions, and when you take big doses every week, you don't get off on the big doses anymore and you turn the TV channel to see someone's boobs fall out. Nash did an interview to set up the four-way later in the show. Bigelow beat Eric Watts in 110 with the greetings from Asbury Park. Watts was called a second-generation wrestler, but in 110 nobody had either the time or the guts, and I'm not sure which, to bring up the fact his father was a legend in the business. Gene interviewed Sting, who didn't come out with the belt. Although Sting didn't wear the trench coat, he will probably be back in it in a few weeks. Booker T beat Meng to keep the TV title when Meng had him in the Tongan death grip, but Stevie Ray ran in during a ref bump and KO'd Meng with the slapjack. Booker didn't see his brother interfere and covered Meng in 5:36. They showed Hogan going in for knee surgery. Hogan was walking into the hospital. These guys have no clue. If Hogan can walk, then he can wrestle. If he's having surgery, fans have to believe he's really hurt. He should at least limp bad, and I know he knows how to do it because he'd do it for 5 or 10 seconds before stopping after being in figure fours all those years. Really, he should be in a wheelchair, unable to walk. He wouldn't sell the injury, and thus, if he doesn't care and it's not portrayed like it's a big deal, nobody else cares, and if they don't care, they don't buy tickets. They showed Flair going crazy in the mental hospital when Scott Hall walked in. Now that was funny. A four-way with Knobbs, Mikey Whipwreck, Horace Hogan and Hawk wound up with Knobbs pinning Whipwreck in 10:28 after Knobbs did a ladder drop onto him. This match was beyond awful. It was just all the weapons with no build, no heat, sloppy spots and guys nobody cared about out there way too long. Scott Steiner beat Savage via DQ in 122 when Savage brushed up against Ref Robinson, who called for the DQ. They never locked up. Savage was accompanied by 2 women, one of which wasn't named. She's actually the woman Gorgeous George is training with to learn to wrestle. A third woman, Medusa, kicked Robinson. All 3 women pulled Robinson's pants off and he was wearing the same Florida Gators underwear as the real Nature Boy. They showed a Gorgeous George training video which was exactly the same as Sable's on WWF. How come when I go to see women's kickboxing matches, they don't dress like Sable and Gorgeous George do in these videos? And I'd hate to think what would happen if they did, like the wrong kind of an explosion. The four-way with Goldberg, Nash, Page and Sting went 7:47 with Savage throwing an object to Page, who hit Nash with it and gave him the diamond cutter for the pin. That Nash is so generous to do the job in this situation. Of course he's getting the strap in 2 weeks. Match wasn't bad, but was such a nothing after the way Sting and Page tore the house down earlier and nobody really cared since Page wound up with the belt. As hard as Page does work, and he was the one who made the earlier match, he's still not what WCW needs to portray its world champion as, a mid-40s guy who can have good matches but who the people really don't accept as a top guy no matter how hard he's pushed. And boy did Sting come out looking like a weenie. There's nothing worse for killing a run than 4 weeks after returning being world champion for less than 2 hours. Davey Boy Smith was released from the hospital on April 21st. He's in a full-body cast and has a new catheter tube placed in him every morning and has a nurse come in every day to take care of him. Basically he was going stir-crazy in the hospital and had to get out. Bischoff called his lawyers, since there is the threat of a lawsuit over the termination, and claimed that he had no idea Smith was hurt as bad as he was and that people had told him Smith wasn't even really hurt. Smith was telling people that before he's done with wrestling, he wants to tag team with his son Harry, now 13. Saturn was hospitalized Monday. Don't know anything about it other than the presumption was his back injury had flared up. Kidman missed Nitro due to a family emergency and he returned home. They did a TV angle claiming both weren't there because, in a sight-unseen angle, they were jumped by Benoit and Malenko before the show. Kurt Hennig was back on April 25th in Minneapolis at a house show match losing via DQ to Conan. Blitzkrieg hurt his knee in the pay-per-view match against Juventud Guerrera and kept going but after the four-way, missed the weekend house shows. His opponent, Mysterio Jr., also missed all the house shows because of his sprained wrist, but was available to work Nitro. Latest on house shows. We didn't get this in last week but April 14th in Daytona Beach, Florida drew 3,742 paying $73,886. For this past week, April 23rd in Chattanooga drew 3,805 paying $77,145. April 24th in Huntsville, Alabama drew 6,128 paying $114,510. And April 26th in Minneapolis at Target Center for a main event where Goldberg beat Flair drew 11,439 paying $304,621. The other two house shows were advertised as Sting vs. Hart, T vs. Hall, Mysterio Jr. vs. Blitzkrieg and Hawk vs. Raven. Only Hawk vs. Raven took place and the only marquee match on the first two shows was Sting beating Bigelow. Merchandise for the week was $197,502 or $5.82 per head. Lee Marshall is playing a wrestling announcer in a Nestle's quick commercial. Another major flop is that Savage's first match in something like 10 months, as brief as it was, only did a 3.6 quarter. Because nobody wants to do house shows anymore since the highest paid guys don't do them, WCW is planning on an incentive plan for the guys that are doing the house shows. The plan isn't completed, but it will be guys getting bonused a certain amount for every show they work, probably $500 and up, depending upon their position on the card. With the regular house shows falling off, Mondays and PPVs carry the load now. There is the real comparison with WWF, which sells out most of its regular house shows because virtually the entire crew is on the card, while WCW house shows are filled with people like Scotty Riggs, David Taylor, Silver King, Eric Watts, etc. that don't even get on Nitro much, let alone wins on Nitro because the top stars do limited or no house shows. Scott Steiner was sued over an incident in 1997 at the All-Star Sports Bar and Grill in Marietta. Brian Hart, who filed the suit against Steiner, Scott reached Steiner, and the restaurant claimed he was attacked without provocation and pushed, shoved and beat on. Steiner admits to hitting Hart once in self-defense, and his attorney claimed he was just there eating dinner and got up to protect someone else. His attorney, Judson Graves, described the incident in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that a group of people were asked to leave the bar, and instead they were about to jump an assistant manager, and Steiner was one of a group of people involved in a fracas. Hart suffered a damaged mouth and a kick to the back in the brawl. Steiner was never arrested or charged with anything. The suit claimed Steiner was working the bar as a bouncer, which wasn't the case. WCW is coming out with Goldberg, Hogan, Savage, and Sting air fresheners. Nash, too. The company that is marketing them wanted the first four, and WCW begged them to include Nash. Chase Tatum, who has done some Saturday night tapings and once worked with Scott Steiner on Nitro, was one of the Masked Master Blasters a few weeks back. On the tape Thunder on April 22nd, there was an interview taped where Flair was to turn the tag match into a six-man, putting Mysterio Jr. and Kidman on opposite teams. They decided against airing the interview because at the time it was done, they hadn't decided on the Nut House angle and Flair never made reference to it. The reason they had the 72 hours was because they knew of the interview of Thunder, but didn't think that the interview on Thunder had been taped and didn't acknowledge the new angle. WWF. April 26 tapings in Hartford, Connecticut drew a sellout 11,981 paying $298,274. They did Shotgun and Super Astros tapings first, plus a dark match with Kurt Angle. Super Astros brought in even more of a skeleton crew this time, only Papi Chulo, El Merenguero, Pantera, Miguel Perez, Jose Estrada Jr., the Middies and Shoichi Funaki. They used the Hardy Boys and Scott Taylor to fill out the shows. The show opened with Rock doing an interview and he began ripping on Shane for screwing up the match the previous night. Shane didn't back down, calling Rock a piece of monkey crap. Rock was about to go after Shane, but wound up hitting Triple H in China before the corporation overpowered him and Shane beat on his candy ass. Shane fired him. As if. Rock challenged Shane to a match for later in the show. X-Pac and Kane beat Gangrel and Edge in 2:34 when Kane pinned Edge after a choke slam. Afterwards the lights went out and the Brood beat on Kane doing the bloodbath gimmick. This was kind of screwed up because the lights were on enough that you could see X-Pac just standing there doing nothing. Then the lights were on and Kane saw X-Pac and choke slammed him over the barricades. Undertaker told Vince to get his daughter back he'd have to hand over the company to him and have Austin deliver the papers. Austin did an interview and Vince begged him to deliver the papers and Austin turned him down. D'Lo Brown beat Val Venis in 3:19 with the sky-high power bomb when Nicole Bass came out to freak Venus out. Ivory jumped on Bass and began choking her, but she got flipped over. Amazing the tricks they do for a panty shot. Ultra short dress. Take a flip overhead with the camera strategically placed, and voila, oh my god, an accident. Val ran away. Billy Gunn seemingly started his heel turn as he sort of ripped on X-Pac for not getting the job done, and came out with new music. He's no longer Billy Gunn. He's now Mr. Ass. You don't know how fake and contrived that sounds until you hear Jim Ross and Jim Cornette, subbing for Jerry Lawler, say Mr. Ass 50 times each in 5 minutes. Anyway, Chyna posted Mr. Ass. She then blocked the ring so Mr. Dog couldn't interfere, and Mr. Triple H used the pedigree for the pin in 6:44. Most of this match was working on Mr. Ass knee. Maybe they should call him Mr. Knee. Mr. Crowd doesn't care about working on any Mr. Body parts, so they were Mr. Dead. Seriously, whenever Triple H is put in a position where he's supposed to have a good match to make himself the star they've been grooming him to be from day one, he usually comes up short. Mankind and Big Show beat Bossman and Test in 4:37 when Bossman played world's worst tag partner and ended up throwing Test to the Sharks. Mankind used the Socko Claw and passed the Test. Bossman yelled at him after. Test decked Bossman, and like in any contrived fight, turned around and walked away, and got jumped and left laying after taking some nightstick shots. X-Pac was looking for Kane. For like 90 minutes. When these wrestlers go backstage, they must hide really good. It's totally believable. When I was in high school at a dance chasing women, they'd somehow hide for like 90 minutes too. But they never came out to music and fireworks, and I was never choke-slammed once. At least by a woman. They aired a Cleavage family vignette. It's exactly what you'd figure. June Cleavage was some bleached blonde siliconed-up female bodybuilder. Godfather kept the IC title beating Jeff Jarrett in 140 with a schoolboy. If Jarrett lost, then Deborah would have to be a hoe. Then when Jeff lost, Hart pulled Deborah away. That stupid pimp. He should have known by now that any deal made in the WWF needs a notarized contract, and even then they'll go to great lengths not to live up to it. PMS and Sean Stasiak were doing a vignette to the Sexual Chocolate music. So I guess his name is going to be Sexual Vanilla. Ken Shamrock was supposed to face Bradshaw, but both acolytes beat up Shamrock and Test ran in to save him. Last week it seemed Shamrock was going to be a major player. This week he's saved by Test. You know things are bad when you're getting saved by Test. Shane vs. Rock went 1 minute or so without a lockup before everyone ran in. Rock used the rock bottom on Rodney and Pete Gas and Shane. What happened to those other 3 dudes that were at ringside at WrestleMania? This isn't WCW. These questions need answers. Triple H and Chyna beat up on Rock and then everyone laid the smackdown on him. X-Pac asked for Kane to come out. Hart and Jarrett jumped him and Kane saved him. Kane choke-slammed Hart and Jarrett, and then choke-slammed X-Pac. Then Kane realized the error of his ways and carried X-Pac to the back. The last time he did that he had a major crush on the person he carried to the back. You don't think? They brought Stephanie out on a symbol. They had this bizarre wedding ceremony for Stephanie, who was in her nicest black wedding dress. She didn't appear happy. Shamrock tried to save her. He was a literal human sacrifice being laid out by Viscera. Big Show came out and did a lot better, actually knocking people down with some of the worst looking offense you'll ever see until Undertaker hit him with a baseball bat and he laid there. Shane wouldn't let the corporation save his sister. You think he'd be concerned being that Vince was giving the company to Undertaker? I guess he didn't figure out he's on TV only because he's Vince's son. When Undertaker owns this joint, his son will become the incompetent announcer on Heat. Finally, Austin saved the day hitting everyone with chairs, untying poor Stephanie from the cross. Stephanie hugged Austin and then hugged Vince. A little too corny for my taste, but the pseudo-drama was going to do numbers. UPN special and the other stuff was taped on April 27th in New Haven. The UPN special was formatted exactly like a Raw. Not much underneath except an angle where Snow refused to give Holly a title shot in an interview with Michael Cole, who Snow called Todd. In reference to the departed Todd Pettingle. Holly attacked Snow and stole the head and said he wouldn't give it back unless Snow agreed to a title shot. Cole and Cornette announced the UPN special. Vince and Stephanie came out first. Vince got a huge face pop. But when fans started chanting asshole at him, fans got into the chant as well. Vince thanked Shamrock, Big Show, hey, isn't the entire reason he turned because he hated Vince? And Austin for helping him get Stephanie back. He then said he was going to promise Austin something, but before he could say what, the corporation music came out with Shane. Vince went to hit Shane but Triple H and Chyna blocked the way. Shane ordered Vince to leave and he did. Shane said Rock and Austin would have to be a team on the show and face the corporation members. Triple H and Bossman raised their hand. Shane picked Triple H but ignored Bossman. Bossman kept volunteering and Shane didn't care. He asked if there were any takers, and Undertaker and Ministry came out, so Undertaker was announced as the partner. Jarrett vs. Venus was scheduled, but Owen Hart came out at the Blue Blazer and beat Venus. Blazer did an interview saying that the state of the WWF was deplorable and told the kids they should say their prayers and eat their vitamins and that he'd be the superhero for all the kids. Godfather tried to get Deborah based on the deal, but Blazer and Jarrett beat him up. Show beat Test. Bossman attacked Test after, but Show chased him away. Rock did an interview. Shane and Undertaker came out and announced the formation of the corporate ministry. X-Pac yelled at Kane. Brown beat Draws via DQ when Prince Albert interfered. They went to piece Brown's tongue, but Ivory and Mark Henry made the save, with Henry getting a good pop and cleaning house. Before the tag title match, Mr. Ass and Mr. Dog were at odds because Dog said he and X-Pac were friends and Ass got his ass in a dander. Long match, maybe 15 minutes. Ass pressed X-Pac overhead, but Kane shoved Dog, who accidentally clipped Ass, and X-Pac fell on top for the pin. Outlaws argued a lot after the match. Doak Hendricks interviewed the Brood. Gangrel can't talk, but Edge's vocals were good. Anyway, he started ripping on them, saying everything they do was just a gimmick to get attention. So the lights went out and the Freebird was left in a bloodbath. Shamrock beat Bradshaw in a street fight, choking him out with a baseball bat. Mankind beat Bossman. Bossman tried to leave once, but Test threw him back. He tried to leave a second time, but Show threw him back into the Socko Claw. Ass attacked X-Pac backstage, and Kane saved him. Hebner came out just before the main event. There was a fairly long break and a huge "you screwed Brett" chant started. Hebner had steam coming out of his gills. Austin and Rock vs. Triple H and Undertaker had no finish. The corporate ministry, Shamrock, Test and Show were all brawling, and they wound up brawling to the back. Shane and Vince ended up fighting, and Vince KO'd Shane. Rock and Triple H brawled to the back. Hebner must have been knocked out at some point. Taker choke-slammed Austin and grabbed a chair. Vince tried to take it, but Taker KO'd Vince with a chair. Shane started pounding on Vince. Austin gave Taker a stunner and gave Shane a stunner, and Austin poured beer on Vince to revive him. In last week's Billboard charts, WWF The Music was number 38 with 32,923 units sold. Glenn Ruth headbanger Thrasher is suing the Philadelphia Phillies for $10 million when a foul ball hit his wife in the left eye, and she's now legally blind in that eye. Although there is something on the back of tickets and baseball and hockey games about the inherent risk, there was a recent court case of a similar situation in a baseball game where the plaintiff was awarded 7 figures. Vince sent a letter to Entertainment Weekly complaining because Goldberg was on the cover of their issue instead of Austin. His basic point was that whatever growth over the past year in pro wrestling was not pro wrestling growth, but WWF growth, a valid point. Then he complained about an inside photo of Goldberg, and over it said something like 35 million people can't be wrong, saying Austin was liked by 2/3 of those people. Geez, 35 million is such a worked figure. There are 11 million wrestling fans who watch on Mondays, and probably a few million more in the country. I think there should be a law against complaining about not getting your fair shake on an issue that's a total work to begin with. He said EU should have let its readers know that their parent company also owns WCW, and that's why Goldberg got the cover. You see, there's always a reason. Fox Files did a piece on Sable on April 23rd. Brills, a magazine that covers the media, is planning a major expose on that show based on a feature on UFC. They aired a piece on underground illegal fighting in California, shooting a show that actually was under Pancrase rules, meaning closed fist punches to the face were illegal. The show wasn't violent enough to make for good enough clips, so they spliced in tape of this savagely brutal no-rules show from St. Petersburg, Russia, and acted like it was taking place in Southern California, and that was what UFC was about. If Steve Regal doesn't get a job soon, he's going to be deported. WWF officials were less than thrilled with a photo of Undertaker in a USA Today story listing things in pop culture that may have inspired the shootings in Colorado. WWF will be running Split Cruise the weekend of May 15 to 16. They are doing the UK pay-per-view show on May 16 from Manchester with Austin vs. Undertaker vs. Triple H for the title on top, plus Shane McMahon vs. X-Pac, Sable vs. Tori in a match that continues until one female is stripped of all clothing except her panties, and Mankind vs. Mr. Ass. In the domestic shows in Baltimore and Richmond, they are going with Rock vs. Big Show with Shamrock, Dog, Bossman, Goldust and Deborah as the headliners, and LOD will be brought in for a rare house show. Dory Funk was released from his role as training camp instructor. The idea is that they are moving the camps to Louisville under Jim Cornette when he moves there over the summer, and Danny Davis. Among those at this past week's camp were Jason Arndt, who was the star of the camp, Mark Henry, released by his doctor to wrestle, but his knee isn't 100% yet. Tom Howard, a California-based wrestler who worked as KGB in AAA. Russ McCulloch, a 6'10", 330-pound guy who is being compared to Kevin Nash and Paul White but has virtually no experience and wrestled under the name Apocalypse at the weekend camp shows. Stephen Gamlin, who played college football in the U.S. and for Frankfurt in the WFL, where he was something of a local celebrity. Robbie Dix, a college wrestler who I know nothing about, who may be the brother of Don Fry, who the WWF is trying to build a relationship with for when his New Japan contract expires. And Rico Cosentino, a worker for Empire Pro Wrestling out of California. The idea in progress is to set up a minor league system where wrestlers will be sent to a Louisville circuit under Cornette, which would be like Class A baseball, and then move up to Power Pro in Memphis, which would be like AAA, before being brought up to the big leagues. There is still nothing definite regarding a full-time show on UPN, as everything depends on the ratings. You know the ratings will be good. CNBC is working on a show on McMahon in June. The episode of Nash Bridges that Austin filmed last week airs on May 14th. It may be the last episode of the show. There hasn't been really any talk of Austin doing a spin-off TV show from his role as a renegade cop on that show of late. Insane Clown Posse is claiming to be returning to WWF to second the new clown, former headbanger Charles Warrington. They claim that if they get mistreated again, they'll just quit again. That's a good attitude to start with. House shows this past week saw April 22nd in South Bend, Indiana drew 10,221, paying $190,820. April 23rd in Toronto at Sky Dome drew 17,402, paying $501,358, and April 24th in Madison Square Garden drew a sellout 16,821, paying $452,594. The South Bend show, which had a lot of weather problems because WWF has been totally cursed by God when it tries to play Notre Dame University with storms forcing 2 postponements in a row, and then the weather was bad again this week and wrestlers arrived late, some not at all, and the show was somewhat makeshift. They also made some concessions for being at a Catholic university. There were no hose and no suck-it chants. At MSG, the fans were really unruly, pelting the ring with garbage, and there was a lot of fighting in the stands. South Bend wound up with Dog and Show over Rock and Triple H on top. Toronto and MSG had Austin and Show over Rock and Triple H. Jerry Lawler did a rare house show match in MSG, getting a huge face reaction, beating draws. MSG sold out months ago and they didn't even do local promos for the first time in history for the show. Godfather and Goldust did the exact same powder routine and shattered dreams on Meanie as they did the next night on the pay-per-view. At MSG, Shane, Pete Gas and Rodney all showed up for the main event. Rock was about to do the elbow and Pete and Rodney were on the apron and Rock bumped into them, gave them a dirty look, which allowed Austin to stun him for the pin. At the Calgary show last week, members of the Calgary Hit men hockey team brought jerseys for Owen, Deborah and Jarrett to wear to the ring. They wanted to, but Jack Lanza wouldn't let them. That old Hit man name there again. Tank Abbott was some time back flown to Connecticut for interviews and a tryout. Abbott told the WWF officials with his usual lack of confidence in himself that he'd be a bigger star than Steve Austin. I don't know if Abbott has signed a contract with WCW or not, as it had been reported that he did, but people close to him claim he was going to sign with WWF in May. There was intrigue about the possibilities of Abbott, because he has a great personality for pro wrestling, not unlike Dick the Bruiser, who turned out to be a gigantic star of a generation ago, if he can perform inside the ring against Austin and Shamrock. Merchandise for the week was $381,369 or $6.76 per head. USA Today ran a story on Sable where she claimed she was 31. In other media appearances she gives her age at less than 30, although we're told she's older than Mark Marrow and he's 35. She was filming First Wave on the Sci-Fi Channel this past week, which is why she missed the pay-per-view and Raw shows. Rock will be the next to do a Chief Boyardee commercial. On the April 12th Raw, when Undertaker talked about putting Christian on the cross live, they did a voice edit when it aired on replay of him saying, "Put him on the symbol." Whatever. When they first started that symbol gimmick on t-shirts, they were marketed as Undertaker Cross t-shirts. This week's Newsweek had a story on what kids like. A scientific study of 16 kids who were sons and daughters of magazine staffers proclaimed that 6 watch pro wrestling, behind 13 who watch The Simpsons, and 9 who watch Rugrats, but according to the story, WCW is in trouble because all 6 were only WWF fans.